The History of Things podcast is brought to you by HistoryNet, publisher of 9 different historical magazines, including the Civil War Times, American History, and Military History. Visit HistoryNet.com to learn more, or follow them on social media by searching for @history_net. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Are you ready?
And welcome back, everyone, to the History Things podcast, doing our 160th commemoration series of shows tonight. And tonight we have our new guest with us to talk about one of the different Western theater aspects of these commemorations.
That's right. Remember, the Blitz this summer is not all about one town.
That's right.
It's not about one town.
Now, joining me, as always, is my co-host, fellow park ranger, and historian. We have Pat McGuire.
What's up, everybody? I am super excited to be here for this one today. As we were just saying, this is going to focus on a bird. Mm-hmm. Man, one of the most famous birds, the American Civil War. We've been talking about it all summer long, haven't we, Matt? Right? Of course, we are super excited to talk about. We're talking about Vicksburg today.
That's right.
You see that dramatic effect right there? Everybody thought I was going to go to Gettysburg. Well, we're already there. You already know this because you've been following that we actually finally went into Gettysburg. We were more successful than a certain Army of Northern Virginia, perhaps. We escaped unscathed. But what we did was we hung out with the absolute legend of Scott Hartwig, talking about the battle itself. We hung out with the legend Cody H, talking about another legend, Alexander Hayes, right? But we need to take a step away from all that because, like most people in the world, we get so focused on 3 days in July north of the Mason-Dixon line in Pennsylvania. And that's not the entirety of the story of July 1863. That's not even the entirety of the story of the war.
Right.
Which we kind of, I guess, boiled the war down to Gettysburg in a mass sense, I guess. Well, I don't even know what I'm looking for here, but we're going to take a step back and we're actually going to go out into the Western theater today. We're going to talk about the siege of Vicksburg.
Correct.
Which is an exciting topic for us, has been always. You've heard us for all the shots and shells we lob at the Gettysburg story, merely because we're Antietam guys. It's the real high watermark, just so you know that. But anyway, the story at Vicksburg has been one that captivated us because it includes some of our favorite characters. And I say characters because of who they just physically are. Grant, looking at you, my guy. But it really is the other half of it's the other shoe
right
in the 1863 story that drops midsummer. It's like a hot album.
There you go.
Our listeners listen to Drake, I'm sure. It drops like a Drake album. That was a bad joke. I apologize. But Matt, we have a legend today to help us. If you are hanging out west, you might know this guy. Matt, who is hanging out with us today on the History
Well,
Things
we
podcast?
actually have a colleague of ours in the Ranger world, Andrew Miller. He's out there and at Vicksburg, and Andrew and I go back almost 4 years at this point. We did black powder training together down in Fort McClellan, Alabama.
Well, welcome to the show, Andrew Miller. How are you, my friend?
Doing great, guys. Thank you for having me on here.
Very excited to have you. So you actually had to hang out with old Stinky Matt. That's a new nickname, Stinky Matt.
I appreciate that.
Powder training in old Alabama with this guy.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, he was on our gun crew. That's all I can say. I don't know about hanging out.
Well, that's true. There was a lot of working the gun.
He snores so loud, dude. You're so lucky. He sleeps in the attic here sometimes just because it's so weird, but I can hear him for miles.
Thanks for that.
So on the gun crew, so artillery. So I worked when he comes home and does Ranger stuff. When I step out of my site and I volunteer, I work on his gun crew. Does he run a when there's none of us volunteers around, is he good? Is he good at what he does, Andrew?
I think he was more than adequate, no doubt about it.
All right.
I greatly appreciate that because the shots we have are of you commanding the gun, I believe.
We had the finest gun crew or detachment in the entire 19th century world there. So
I agree with that.
No, not even a doubt in my mind about that.
Yeah, my colleague directly at the site I work at was down there with the 18th century crew. So if you saw some guy in a weird red matter red coat, black facings, that was our old Fort Frederick squad. 6-pound naval guns. Let's go. But we're not here to talk about naval guns, but are we?
Might.
Are we? Andrew, when we talk about Vicksburg, this is a massive story. How do we start it? Like I always lob the simple question: if you were telling this story, where is your starting point? So like I'll lob it to you knowing that that's kind of a loaded question. Where do you start the story of the siege of Vicksburg?
Right. Yeah, I think the first and foremost, for the average visitor, just asking the basic questions. It's a 47-day prolonged siege. This military park that's here in Vicksburg, Mississippi, it's one of the 5 original military parks created by the Congress in the 1890s. So it's created by the veterans themselves. But it's not like the other conventional 4 battlefields. And the other 4, there's not one that's similar to the other one. They're all unique in their own way. But Vicksburg is an engineering campaign in siege. This particular location, people want to come here and see pitched battle like you would at Antietam or Gettysburg, Shiloh, Chickamauga, Chattanooga. And it's just not that. I mean, yeah, that Grant does try to assault the city by force. He spends 2 days doing that. He takes 4,000 casualties trying to assault a fixed position and realizes that there's no way he could possibly force his way in. And he has to reduce himself to siege operations, or as he would have called it in his memoirs, he has to out-camp the enemy. Ultimately, that's the story of at least the siege of Vicksburg. But I would go back and say this is believe it or not, it's a 14-month-long campaign. We talk about campaign, and modern historians would say, there's these. It really begins December 1862 when Grant and Sherman, as far as the armies are concerned, coordinating with the Navy. But it really goes back to May of 1862 with Admiral Farragut. At the time, Flag Officer David Glasgow Farragut coming up from New Orleans, starting to capture the major cities along the Mississippi River. Charles Davis coming down the river with the Brownwater Navy, coming in this naval pincer. And where do they arrive? In the middle of the summer 1862, they arrive at Vicksburg on this hairpin turn on the river, with the objective of shelling it to submission and forcing it to surrender, and it ends in failure for them. And ultimately, what the Union, the federal government, really the Union forces, those joint military operatives in this theater find out is it's not just the Confederate forces here or the civilians. They're much. They're really, it's the nature of the river and the terrain itself that is really going to be the dominating factor in how they prosecute this campaign. The river rises and falls, the inundation of land so that troops can't move on it, the loess soil that is on the eastern bank of the Mississippi that forms the major hills and ravines is just not adequate for 19th century military operations. It's just not. And it's really not what any conventional Civil War army has been used to up to the time period where they engage in this type of terrain. They have not seen it before. And to your point, it's a pivot for Grant and him being an adaptive general to the situation at hand. And we'll talk more about that. But it begins in May of 1862 with the Navy. And then finally in the fall, November, December 1862, Grant starts to prosecute what is called the Mississippi Central Campaign. And that many modern military historians looking at the Vicksburg campaign would say that is when the Vicksburg campaign starts.
Because it begins at that point in a direct line to what would be the July story, the June-July story?
Well, we talk about who are the major players in the story of the Vicksburg campaign. And on the Confederate side would be Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton. And if we're familiar with our Western theater history, or even our Eastern, if we go into the Southeast, down in Charleston, this guy Pemberton went from a lieutenant colonel of artillery to a brigadier general to a major general in command, second in command in Charleston under Robert Edward Lee. And Lee is tasked with coming back to Richmond in March of 62. And what happens to Pemberton? He's promoted to the command of that department. And he gets in trouble with the governor of South Carolina, the people of Charleston. And to solve the situation, Confederate President Jefferson Davis removes him from command and sends him west to Vicksburg in command of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana, a fairly quiet sector of the war at the time period. And it's kind of, I have this problem, let me remove him to somewhere where there's not going to be any issues, right? Vicksburg and the river are formidable.
Dude, I've heard this story. Like, literally stop right now, because you're talking about Dixon Miles and Harper's Ferry, right?
Good reference.
We literally just heard this story. It's 1862. Right. It's Harper's Ferry. Dixon Miles, you're a drunk. Go to this quiet place. Nothing happens. Oops.
Right. And that's interesting because there's so many commands that are shelved. But they're shelved in a bad way. They're not just, and not to go into the monocracy thing, but there's all those Union generals in D.C. looking for commands at that time period. Those are shelved generals.
Yeah,
they just
absolutely they are.
At the time period. But, Davis had a real issue because South Carolina was vital. He needed their support. He did not want that. They were the birthplace of secession. And it was obviously an incredibly important city to hold on to. And Pemberton's mentality was, hey, if the Federals are here and we can't hold them back, we'll evacuate the city and retake it. And that was something that could never happen. So anyway, without harping on too much Pemberton, he's sent out here to this department, and he runs into Major General Earl Van Dorn, and we get into this hierarchy of date of rank, who outranks who. And of that problem, Davis promotes Pemberton to lieutenant general and commander of the department. And so now, just to get into the perspective of who John Pemberton was at the time period, his pre-war career, he was a Mexican-American war officer. He was a graduate of the class of 1837 at West Point. He is a trained military officer. He is a professional soldier. He is an administrative officer predominantly. And he finds himself in a very short time period rapidly promoted and put in of a crucial department where when he arrives in the fall of 1862 it's quiet, but things are ramping up in the West. And so for Pemberton, he arrives at a crucial time period where things are going to start rapidly advancing pretty quickly for him. To counter that, and probably there's not too many people that can't say that they don't admire, they may not love, but admire Ulysses S. Grant. But I love Grant. I have no problem saying that.
We love Grant, and we will fight you if you come at Grant in a unrealistic tropey way. Like, there is a real good story there, and that dude was the man, straight up.
100%. He doesn't want to go to college. His dad tells him to go to college. He goes to college. He doesn't really like it that much. And of course, we're talking about college. We're talking about the United States military academy.
Yeah. He hates West Point.
He reads novels. He's really good at art. To pull another national park site, but Weir Farm and Robert Weir was his professor at West Point, and he's a really good artist. And now they're hanging Grant's artwork in the museum at West Point, in the military museum.
Wow.
He held he obviously, we know he was an equestrian. He loved horses. He had the jump record at West Point that held for decades. I mean, but not what you would embody as the great minds that were coming out of West Point. And we're talking about those in their first in their class, second in their classes, that become major engineers or artillery officers, or what you name it. I mean, he's an infantry officer, and he goes out west and he makes a name for himself in the Mexican War. And he's an adequate infantry officer. He becomes a quartermaster, so he understands the importance of logistics and supply. I mean, all of these things that really influence his what will eventually influence his career as a general. But we know his story. We know Grant's failures and the things that he went through, his bouts with alcoholism, which, you read Chernow and you read a variety of different historians. There's no doubt that he suffered from, some of those maladies, if you will, or whatever. But Flash forward to the war, and we know how he gets into the war. We know he's successful and he's not successful. But the summer of 1862 in the Western Theater, to catch everybody up, is really stagnation for the federal war effort. I mean, these armies aren't doing much. They're guarding railroads, and they're stretching their lines to the point where they cannot conduct a proper military operation. So when Grant takes command in October of 62, he writes General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, and he says, "You've never given me any orders or vision or objectives for what we're supposed to be. So I'm going to do it." And he hyper focuses on Vicksburg, and that's going to be the objective. No matter what, there's a Confederate bastion there. They have fortified along the river. At this particular point, they are also starting to fortify the land approach to the city, and he realizes that that's going to be crucial to opening up the river. So he starts to focus on that as a campaign. So military historians focus on the fall of 1862 because Grant and Pemberton both take their commands and start looking at what they need to do to conduct their particular operation. For Pemberton, it's a stagnated, large-scale defense of a large area. And for Grant, he's just got to get to Vicksburg and take it.
Like, just run on it. Like, that's at this point, he's just considering just break it, run into it and break it.
Right. And I think that the opportunity that Grant really has for at least the Mississippi Central campaign really is he's going to be testing out a variety of different things. But remember, West Point graduate, he does look at the book. You know, he is looking back on his education and he's thinking about how do you conduct an operation like this. And ultimately, he starts to stretch his supply lines. He establishes a supply base at Holly Springs, Mississippi, and he's doing it by the book. And he's becoming successful throughout late November and through December 1862. He's pushing Pemberton's army, who really is kind of falling back from defensive position to defensive position along the major rivers in Mississippi. And Grant is starting to progress this campaign successfully. But what's happening is that length of between his supply bases in Memphis and Holly Springs, and ultimately that, when we go down the road, is what forces his campaign to fail. Is just who do he put in charge? We were just talking about Harper's Ferry and putting the wrong guy in command, but he does the same thing twice. We were talking about Grant being the successful commander. He puts the same officer, Colonel Robert Murphy of the famous 8th Wisconsin, the Eagle Regiment that we know so much about, and he puts him in charge of a supply base in Iuka, and then the guy evacuates it and it gets captured. And Grant puts him in charge of his supply base at Holly Springs after that, knowing what happened the first time. And it's an abject lesson and picking the wrong person. And ultimately, the first thing Grant does is immediately dismiss him from the army. Not even mess around. I messed up the first time, shame on, what is it? The famous thing, fool me once, shame, right? Or yeah, I mean, that's effectively Grant right there. But what you start to see beyond the Shiloh campaign and the big move on Corinth, Mississippi, is Grant is learning and adapting and failing. And that's okay, because every single failure, he's getting better. Yeah. And I mean, we all learn from our failures, and Grant is the perfect example of that during the American Civil War.
He shares a lot in common with General Washington from the Revolution and French Major in the French and Indian War, where he is riddled with mistake, but he learns from these mistakes, whereas a lot of people don't. And George in the French and Indian War, young man, ton of mistakes. Well, guess what? Those lessons learned benefit us, 20 years later when we establish this nation. Grant similarly has made life mistakes, military mistakes. And when the chips really start to fall for him at the moments they need to for the Union, the lessons have been learned. Is this guy that he just dismisses from the army the first guy he fires in his series of people that he just starts firing when he gets various commands? Because he fires David Hunter pretty hard out here, and we love that story.
No doubt. Yeah, no, I think that there's definitely a case for Grant's favoritisms. It's almost, to be completely honest, Grant the thing that we harp on a lot at any park I've ever worked in, and of course specifically this one with Grant himself, is we as just Americans, and maybe just this is just a human thing, is we put our heroes on a pedestal.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Wrong, even when we know they do wrong, they still can't do no wrong, and you see that time and time again where it's like they're infallible. There's nothing that they can do wrong, but we know that's not the truth, and we know that Grant had his problems. We also know that he favored at least professionally military trained officers to those that were not. He's very quick to get rid of certain people if he does not like them or think they're adequate for the position that they're in, which we see. That can be a good thing sometimes, right? But at the same time, you also see that favoritism. There's a rift between him and William Rosecrans that happens in 1962 after the Battle of Iuka. And really, it's unfortunate because they liked each other so much. They actually were friends. Mm-hmm. But backbiting that's going on behind Grant's back, and quite frankly, there's nothing that Rosecrans could have done at that point to save their relationship. And ultimately, what saves them is that Rosecrans is sent to take over command of what ultimately becomes the Army of the Cumberland and the Department of the Cumberland, and he becomes the commander at that time period. But Grant is very much valuable, and he has faults. But in this campaign, in the beginning, he is starting to learn and realizing what are the things that work, what are the things that don't work. I'm learning from my enemy, and his enemy at this time period is not a Confederate general after Confederate general, right? He's not having to look. He's facing Pemberton, and he's watching Pemberton retreat and do things by the book. And he's also doing things by the book, but he's starting to figure things out. And he's realizing, okay, I know this guy. And I'm starting to realize how the type of officer that he is, and I can work with this. And ultimately, that's what starts to happen at this time period. And it plays out from December of 1862, when he fails in the Mississippi River campaign, or the Mississippi Central Railroad campaign, ultimately through until he captures Vicksburg.
I wonder if there's some value in what you're talking about, Andrew, is, when it's general after general after general, you have to constantly get to learn a new person's, application of strategy and tactic. But when, you see the same guy, you start to pick up the habits, the cues, the tendencies. And I was thinking it might not be as direct, because this is, one person watching another person kind of make decisions and you're learning. But, over here in our world, in Matt's world, you have a series of commanders that are not initially Ricketts at this battlefield when this story really is starting, but Ricketts has been around the whole war. So He had seen a lot of these guys that he's going to come up against at Monocacy in other places. And I wonder how much that's similar. I might know Gordon a little bit better because I've seen him here. Like, just, the value of, I guess, consistently meeting. There's something to be said for that. Now, real quick, before I forget, I need to do this for our listeners. Pemberton. This is not Coca-Cola Pemberton.
Yep.
It's right.
So, this is kind of interesting because Vicksburg is this weird little microcosm in all of these different facets of history that seem to just come back together all the time here. So, to my knowledge, and I think I went through the whole ancestry thing to make sure that this was true, because we got this all the time. This is basically the who's buried in Grant's tomb question that when somebody walks the door, they're like, so Pemberton, Coca-Cola, and you're like, no. But so Pemberton's he's a Pennsylvanian. He's from just outside, just west of Philadelphia. He had an older brother, and all the Pemberton stayed in that area virtually, right? John obviously went to West Point. He went into the military. He married a Virginian, and we know that's the catalyst that pulls him into the Confederate services. His wife's basically like, "Are you not with us?" Right? And him being a totally indecisive person, and I don't care what any guy says. Women do rule the roost, but
dude, we say this on this show, Andrew, very regularly. We know who wears the pants.
Right.
Yeah, it's not me.
For sure. Who wears the petticoat in that relationship? And Pemberton, very much an indecisive man, was so conflicted when the war began because he he was loyal to the Union, and his family were Northern, and he 30, almost 30 years by that point of federal service in the Army. I mean, my God, what a conundrum. But we all know family is family, and you go with your family no matter what. I mean, right or wrong, and we've all been in those scenarios. But anyway, Pemberton had an older brother. He moved to Georgia. He became a planter. His son, John Pemberton, became a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate service from Georgia. And that nephew, John Pemberton, is the one that creates Coca-Cola in Atlanta. I believe
So they are the same family.
It is the same family. It's John Pemberton's nephew, John Pemberton, that created Coca-Cola. And I love the drunk. Oh, is it Drunk History or who played him? They do John Pemberton creating Coca-Cola, and it's oh my God, who's the guy that Bill Hader?
Oh yes,
cocaine and mixing stuff in. It's like insane, and you're like, probably not far from the truth. Maybe, I don't know, but
original Coca-Cola was probably awesome.
And no doubt that people were definitely enjoying themselves in the 1890s before. But the reason why it's weird is there's a family, the Biedenhorn family here, and they started sending Coca-Cola throughout the U.S. at that time period, especially in the American South. And this is the first place that it was ever bottled and distributed anywhere. So the Biedenhorn family had the ability to bottle Coke, and they would send it on a milk cart into the county, and the people east caught hold and were like, "Whoa, you're bottling this stuff and sending it?" And they were like, "Yeah." So they don't get any, much like Pemberton doesn't get any of the royalties because he sold them for Coke. The Biedenhorns don't get the royalties for actually bottling it, which if they would have done that, they would have been gazillionaires, and for bottling a product. But here's my baseball trivia for the Old English D. Who made a lot of money off of Coca-Cola? That's my trivia for you guys. Who do you think in baseball's history would have made a lot of money off of Coca-Cola?
Well, I mean, because you tugged on the Old English D, I'm trying to think of yes, you tugged on the Old English D. You said it. I'm trying to think of Dodgers players.
Not Dodgers.
I don't know why I said Dodgers. Tigers players. I'm trying to I'm trying to think,
I don't even know baseball, and I knew it.
But I'm trying to think like in reasonable, like I'm probably thinking like World War I era, dead ball era players, right?
100%.
Did Ty Cobb play for Detroit?
Did.
Is it Ty Cobb?
It is Ty Cobb. He invested in Coca-Cola early and made several $1 million off of Coca-Cola. He was a Georgian, so he invested in the company, and so baseball made him money, but Coca-Cola made him a millionaire, man.
We like Ty Cobb. Not that, I mean, Ty Cobb's a very controversial character. Like when you really get into who he was personally, we're not going to do that right now. But I love the baseball Ty Cobb, and then World War I guys. That dude was in like either a flamethrower or a chemical weapons unit. Like not chemical fun stuff.
Yeah, he was an officer in a chemical weapons unit, I believe. I mean, I don't think he went overseas, but I mean, whatever. I mean,
even so, if he did end up overseas, regardless, if his unit had ever made it over there, that's the worst part of World War I.
Right, exactly. But who better than Tyrus Raymond Cobb to this angry Georgian to unleash chemical warfare on the world? I guess I don't know. He was unleashing chemical warfare on the baseball diamond. That's all I know. But there's a good biography. We won't stray too far into baseball too much, but there is a biography that they wrote about Ty Cobb, and it is completely challenged almost every single thing that the original biographers wrote about Cobb, because they were taking a lot of conjecture, secondhand information, and making it fact. So if you're interested in baseball history, it's a phenomenal book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but look it up. It basically dispels the myths of Cobb. And
dude, so that you're going to have to come back on this show when we do the baseball history episode, because it's not a secret. I'm a huge baseball guy. So first, I want to apologize. It's been a super long day behind the scenes. Matt and I have been out doing lots of work to support the Gettysburg 160 stuff that we were doing. So the Sun Front, I didn't mean the Dodgers. Like, I know better. That's why I recovered. Jesus, people. But no, like, I'm a huge baseball guy. Like, even though I'm a Yankee fan, like, I'm still, we shouldn't have designated hitters personally. Like, I got a lot of baseball. So if you're a baseball guy, dude, you got to come be a part of that show. Before we move on, other than Ty Cobb, who is another famous Tiger from the dead ball era? Because I couldn't think of another one.
Goose Gossage would be the other one then at the top of my head.
Yeah, but he's ours. He's in the Hall of Fame wearing this hat.
He is, but he still played for the Tigers. Oh God, they got.
I know Gary Sheffield was out there.
Oh my God, Wahoo Sam. Oh my God, now you're making me think. We'll come back. We'll do the baseball podcast, and I'll.
Not that Vicksburg wasn't hard enough. Now we're quizzing you on it. But
last question: did they play baseball in Vicksburg at all during the war?
You know what's crazy? They actually were playing baseball up in Lake Providence, which is about 75 miles north of here, where the 17th Corps was stationed in the late winter and spring of '63. So they were playing baseball here. And then, believe it or not, post-war, there was a Vicksburg baseball club, which was very popular. I think '66, '67. So there is baseball going on immediately after the war, and that's because there's so many ex-federal soldiers that just stayed in Vicksburg and made it their residence. So, there's a lot of good baseball history too.
Dude, I can't wait to do that episode. You definitely have to come back.
I worked at Fort Pulaski, man. I mean, we played Civil War baseball in the fort. I mean, it was one of the best gigs that and I'll plug that park. But it was one of the best gigs working there because, you get to dress up like a Civil War soldier, but then just, run the bases, man, which is fun.
You better leg it out. I'll say it doesn't matter what century you're in. You better hustle your ass for that 90 feet. Otherwise, I'm taking you out of the game, son.
100%. And there's their chief of interpretation. His name is Joel Kadoff, and he's a Boston guy.
Yeah.
He caught one. Because it's slow pitch underhand, and he caught one I threw, and I thought it was going out of the fort. That's how hard he hit it. I couldn't believe how. We watched it sail, and I was like, well, that's getting out of here, and it just corked off the brick wall at the top, and that's.
Oh man, dude, that's awesome! You got to play baseball. I just went to that fort for the first time in my life this past winter. I love forts; it was awesome. But you got to play baseball inside the
right. It was part of our job, so
that's right.
Perk.
Dude, rad. That's so rad. All right, well, maybe one day we'll find out if they played baseball at all during this siege or not. But all right, so getting back into it then.
So sort of where we left off. So you have the major players. You have Grant. You have Pemberton. You have a wild cast of characters as far as division commanders are concerned. But really, the one that we can mention the first two, which is obviously William T. Sherman, who ends up being the commander of the 15th Army Corps, and you have the young protege, both Grant and Sherman's young protege, James B. McPherson, and we obviously know about him and what happens. He gets killed at the Battle of Atlanta. But you have these two professionally trained West Point graduate generals. But then you have, by date of rank, John Alexander McClernand, who is a political general.
He's something else, too.
He is literally a man of two faces, and he definitely talks out of both sides of his mouth, as a politician would. But what he proves from the Battle of Belmont early on in November of 1861, early in Grant's military career, right? And he proves that he's actually an able combat commander. Now, they don't do so well at Belmont, but then there's Fort Donelson, there's Shiloh, they progress towards Corinth. He's not involved in the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou that's here, but Arkansas Post. He's really an able combat commander and dependable. And in talking over the years with the former historian Terrence Winchell, that used to work at Vicksburg for 30 years, renowned historian, he always made the point, and I agree with him. And it's, not just because he's a great guy, but McClernand is so Grant, as a professionally trained military officer who's adapting to the situation and looking for the best man at the right time and time again puts McClernand in the forefront. Why does he consistently put Sherman, or why doesn't he consistently start to test out McPherson? Why does he always put John McClernand? And the answer could very easily have just be succinctly like, well, he wanted to, put him out there. If he fails, he fails, right? And he's got there's no skin off his back. Let him fail, then he gets rid of him. But McClernand, on the back end of Grant, while he's performing well on the battlefield, he's subverting Grant, and he becomes really Grant's biggest thorn in his side, which is unfortunate, because if he was not, he didn't have the political aspirations that he had, and the quite frankly the narcissistic ego that he had. I think that their relationship would have probably lasted a lot longer throughout the war. Ironically, McClernand, who had his eyes set on the White House in 60, he wanted 64, but obviously if that didn't happen beyond, if he just would have been a soldier and prosecuted the war the way Grant wanted it, I don't know. I mean, again, what ifs? I don't like to do the what if game, but he may have gotten what he wanted. And that's the ironic part. But instead, he used his influence with Lincoln from June of 62. So we're talking months and months and months version of going there. Now, as Antietam guys, you're very aware of the famous picture learning on the battlefield. And what is he doing? He's bending the ear of Lincoln. He's been the biggest mosquito in Lincoln's ear. Lincoln is trying to find out what's going on with McClellan and what's the scenario going on in the post Antietam, and you got this Western general that's just buzzing around trying to get his independent command to capture Vicksburg. Which,
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that, Andrew, because for our listeners who, again, we do a lot with the Maryland campaign. Big fans of that. But those famous images from the Grove Farm of Lincoln's visit in October of 62, that guy who's standing next to him, who's not George B. McClellan, that's McClernand. He's, again, Western Corps commander who is out doing his own machinations, trying to get that independent command, which he will get, interestingly enough.
Dude, Lincoln's like, I came out here and I got the wrong mixed general. I came with the McClellan and I got the McClernand. Like, what's happening here? Shouldn't you be in freaking Tennessee or someplace right now, dude?
Absolutely.
That's how Lincoln talks, by the way, so everybody knows that.
Oh, okay.
Right. No, it's, that's, you know better than I don't know. Lincoln, I like Daniel Day-Lewis and his portrayal of Lincoln. Maybe I don't know. I just think he's pretty spot on with that one. But I prefer for hip hop Lincoln. It reminds me of just as another sidebar, but it reminds me when I was working at Pulaski. Just to go back to that, we had a day where we had 3 Lincolns show up at the same time, and they were all kind of competing with each other. So you had multiple 4 scores, and it was. It was a lot. So anyway, the McClernand thing is interesting because he does get the independent command in the fact that he has the ability to go recruit in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And for Lincoln, he wants to drum up more support for the administration and the war. You use your influence to make us look good with how the war is progressing. But the reality is, McClernand is influential. He is organizing volunteer regiments in those 3 states. They are arriving rapidly down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to Memphis. They're organizing. And what happens? Grant is prosecuting that Mississippi Central Railroad campaign we were talking about earlier. And he's worried that McClernand will imminently show up. McClernand was at that point getting married back in his I believe Springfield, Illinois. But while he's getting married, Grant is so worried about this guy showing up and superseding the authority over Sherman that he sent Sherman back to Memphis. They organized all 32,000 of those federal soldiers that McClernand worked hard on organizing and recruiting. And they go on an amphibious campaign, a pincer movement, while Grant is marching down that rail line. Sherman's detached to come down to the Mississippi River and attack Vicksburg from the rear. And that's the Battle of Chickasaw Bluffs or Bayou at the end of December 62. And now Sherman, for a variety of reasons, fails dramatically. And his report is very succinct. I believe it was, I arrived at the appointed time, I landed, I assaulted and failed. That's his report for Chickasaw.
And I've seen that terrain for Chickasaw Bayou. That would not have been a fun place to attack. And there's a lot of terrain advantages Confederate forces have there. But I'm curious, Andrew, I didn't realize that Sherman's troops at that point were all those brand new guys. I'm wondering if that had something to play in it too.
Right. Well, actually, and yeah, it is a good point. So part of the 32,000 is Sherman takes one division from Grant's army, Morgan Smith's, a trusted veteran division that had fought at the Battle of Shiloh. So there are veterans involved in that, but there are a lot of new soldiers. That's their first campaign that they're involved in, and it's not a good one.
Right.
They get on steamers. A lot of these guys had never rode a steamer. They arrive at Memphis on boats for the first time, and they get back on. They ride down the river. Again, seasickness, you name it. I mean, it's a terrible situation for these guys. They arrive down here on Christmas Day.
Right.
Only the officers are allowed off the boats, right? Of course, unless they're going out. There's one expedition under Stephen Burbridge that's sent to cut a rail line on the peninsula in Louisiana, but the rest of these guys are stuck on the boats. That's Christmas for them, and they all write about how miserable they are. And then they disembark on the 26th. And from the 26th to the 29th, 3 full days, the Federals could have figured out how to assault the bluffs. The Confederates had almost no troops in Vicksburg at that point. So that part of the Mississippi Central campaign, and again, I don't want to harp too much on that because we got a lot more to talk about as far as the siege is concerned in the time period that we're at. But Grant's supply lines at Holly Springs, his supply base that he was utilizing, is actually attacked and destroyed by Confederate cavalry under Earl Van Dorn. They destroy his supply base. That's December 20th. Sherman leaves on December 20th, and he reaches Helena, Arkansas with confirmation that Grant's supply lines have been destroyed, and he still sends his men down the river. Grant is retreating. Sherman's going down the river to try to take Vicksburg, and believe it or not, Confederate interior lines, their railroads actually work out for them.
Wow.
And Mississippi all the way to Vicksburg, they start shipping troops, and those troops start to arrive on the 26th, 27th, 28th. And by the time Sherman's assault on the 29th, there's more than enough Confederate soldiers, many of them veterans soldiers, that are able to blunt that assault. And he takes what I always say the most patriotic casualty list on any paper of the Civil War: 1,776 casualties assault by
America.
Take a couple hundred, virtually nothing. But what does that do for the Vicksburg campaign? Well, Grant fails, and ultimately that command dynamic. McClernand shows up. He takes the two corps, if you will, and they go up to Arkansas Post, and McClernand successfully captures 6,000 Confederates at Arkansas Post, and that's for what Grant thought was actually something that wasn't that big of a deal. Turns out that as he comes down to Vicksburg and tries to figure out how to crack this proverbial nut that he can't figure out how to do, those 6,000 Confederates that he captured could have stuck behind him and figured out how to do some nasty business. So McClernand helps him out with that particular part of the campaign. But ultimately, Grant realizes, much like he does in 64, I must take command in the field. I must be with the army to watch it prosecute the campaign it's about to do. And ultimately, that helps, again, with that command dynamic. McClernand is relegated to command of the 13th Corps. Sherman is the 15th Corps. Now McPherson is in charge of what would be the 17th Corps, and he has solidified his army. But now they're on the west bank of the Mississippi River in the worst possible terrain they could have been in, on the levees and in the low-lying plains of Louisiana, as the river rises and falls, and the men start falling out from disease and diarrhea, of every malady you can possibly think about, and men start dying by the hundreds. And this is the point for your listeners, that I would say that this is the point in Grant's military career where his star is truly waning. His star is Grant. We think Grant is always on the up and up. There's many politicians in the Midwest. There's many civilians in the Midwest that would like to see Grant disposed and have another commander take command of the Union Army out west, because of those casualty lists that are being printed in the newspapers in Chicago, Detroit, Cincinnati, all those young men dying of disease. What's happening? Zero, nothing, as far as they're concerned. And so they want Grant gone. And no matter, we know that the Civil War, especially for Union generals, is, what have you done for me lately?
Oh,
and not the truth.
absolutely. It's not. It's not a what have you done. It's what have you done lately. That's a great way to put that. And I was thinking as you were saying that it's been a long time since Forts Henry and Donaldson.
Right.
It's been a long time since Shiloh.
Yeah.
We're talking. Those are February 62, April 62. We're into 63. Irrelevant to this potentially. Nashville falls immediately, essentially, in 1862. Is that a part of this story at all? Because that's, I mean, I'm not geographically great. Forgive me, everybody out there, but I don't necessarily know how directly related this city of Vicksburg and Nashville would be. But that's a pretty significant city in the Confederacy. It falls. I think it's the third largest city total in the Confederacy. It falls right away. Is Nashville relevant at all to this? Because Grant his successes that were long ago are in Nashville's sphere.
Right. Yeah, no, there's no doubt. The Confederacy's plan is a stagnated defense. And, Jefferson Davis, who's in charge of the grand military strategy of the Confederacy, we're going to defend all of our land, right? Yeah, we'll pick key strategic locations, but we're going to defend it all. It's ours. And at that point in the war, he is established on the east along the Cumberland River. He's got the soldiers under First Brigadier General Felix Zollicoffer defending the location around Mill Springs. He's got obviously with Leonidas Polk invading Kentucky in September '61. That neutrality that Kentucky was holding on to is now gone.
Right.
So now you have Bowling Green being the center or that anchor of the Confederate defensive posture. And then on the left or the west, you have, Columbus, Kentucky. And when Forts Henry, well, really it's Mill Springs, right? When Mill Springs first happens and the Confederates are defeated, that right flank is crushed in, and any Confederate forces that went through Cumberland Gap find themselves retreating through East and into Middle Tennessee. And then you have dominoes, right? That's January 9th. 62. Then you have the first 2 weeks of February, Forts Henry and Donaldson fall. You have the two flanks just caving in on themselves, and of course Bowling Green, they just retreat, and they basically get to Nashville and realize they can't hold it, and so they just retreat. And Grant arrives in Nashville, much to the chagrin of Don Carlos Buell, and Bill Nelson's division of the Army of the Ohio at the time period. And Grant arriving, and Buell doesn't get the credit, right? But yes, every single one of these in the Western Theater, these dominoes, they fall, will ultimately impact why Vicksburg becomes at least important in the grand military strategy of possessing and taking ownership of the entire Mississippi River.
So I guess it's just been a while since a domino has fallen then, is I guess the atmosphere. So it's not that they aren't falling, it's been a while.
Well, we have to remember at this time period a variety of different things, and you're very well aware of this. Fredericksburg is a military disaster.
Right.
The Mud March is a military disaster. The Battle of literally the Fredericksburg of the West, Chickasaw Bayou, is a military disaster. I mean, you're talking about an assaulting force that tries to take a fixed fortified position, and the Confederates dominate it. Both of those happen and very close to one another. And we have to understand the mentality of the North at the time period was the morale was very low, and you had the gubernatorial elections, especially in the Midwest. There was a lot of change. A lot of Republican governors became Democratic governors at the time period, and the opinions of people in the Midwest are like, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe we just need to let the Confederacy go, and the Lincoln administration is incredibly concerned because January 1st, they have arguably the biggest event that's going to happen in the administration's history.
Yeah.
Is the Emancipation Proclamation is becoming law. It's becoming it. And because of that, the people of the North are trying to figure out what's the right thing. And ultimately, is Grant the guy? And, Lincoln has his famous quote, and I don't want to butcher it, but I guess I will. He says, I like this man. This man fights. I think I'll try him a little longer, and butchered it, which is okay. But
let's stay with that for just a moment, Andrew. Not the butchering of the quote, but
I'm good at that.
We butcher quotes regularly. Don't worry. Welcome
no
to the
worries.
Right.
The emancipation, though, with Grant campaigning in the West, has he been taking advantage of the Second Confiscation Act? Because I know he's going to have a lot of African-American laborers and then later USCT troops that are going to be helping with the periphery operations around Vicksburg. But in the later part of 62, early 63, is he utilizing African-American labor and assistance from the Second Confiscation Act and maybe even arming some of these men, which was allowed under that act?
Right. Well, definitely not arming anybody at this stage of the game, but Grant has started to see this initiative. Even, I mean, he understands, the Emancipation Proclamation is happening. He understands that it's at that particular point a very tenuous prospect in his army. Mm-hmm. There are abolitionist generals in his army, but there's not a lot. I mean, there are men that are for abolition, but there's just as many that are not in Grant's army. The Midwesterners are a very unusual lot, and you have very much white supremacy and the racial hierarchy, but you have also as far as their opinions on different nationalities in the army too, and that happens in the East. But these Western guys, they don't like Germans. They are don't like Irish. They don't like anybody that is not, Anglo-Saxon, English descent American. And
Andrew, I was going to make a joke, and I'm glad you spoke fast enough for me to not slip it in, because when you said, the Midwesterners are like a weird lot, I was going to be like, yeah. Right. And then you were like, the white supremacy. And I was like, well, that's not. Well, so I'm going to stop the joke, because that's not my guy, but for sure. Racist, right. Not. But I was like, okay, Midwesterners. Oh, they are weird like that.
Well, it's a good point, though. The Northwest Territory, what becomes the Midwestern states, is found or developed under this idea that there would be no slavery in those states. That does not mean they're abolitionist. That does not mean they're for the rights of African Americans. It just means they don't want slavery existing there.
Yeah.
Right. Free labor does not necessarily equate to abolition or equality or anything. Right. It's just everybody gets a fair chance, and that those fair, quite frankly, not to go on this tangent, but the fair chance is white men will get a fair chance at labor, and be paid for and compensated for that. They're very much afraid of what potentially could happen. But I think the interesting point is Grant's army, which is vehemently anti-abolitionist for a long period of time. This is a time period where it changes. Mm-hmm. Right now, that the reason why it changes is because now they're in the Deep South. Yeah, they had been, again, marching and campaigning in a variety of different locations, but now they are truly in Louisiana and Mississippi, and these are the places where that deep chattel slavery and how and the degradation of a race of people, they are finally actually seeing that. It's not just words on a piece of paper that they buy, at their local store. It's real. And Christian morality, no matter whom you are, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or whatever, at that time period, as they're reading their Bibles, and there's slavery in the Bible, but they are starting to realize that the morality, the Christian morality, this is wrong. This is wrong. And we're actually starting to see it. And you start to see a lot of guys change. Now, to answer your question, yes, they are starting to use a variety of African Americans in the Army for a variety of reasons, but they're not arming them yet. That won't happen until Lorenzo Thomas arrives in March of 63, and he does his big, what I call the Moses call. He goes up and down the Mississippi Valley, especially when he gets to Grant's army, and he starts telling him about the initiative of organizing African-American regiments into the United States Colored Troops, eventually the United States Colored Troops, and that you, as an enlisted man, private, corporal, sergeant, have the ability now to become a commissioned officer in one of these units, and we want zealous and determined young men to be officers in these new units, to train these soldiers and make them capable soldiers in the United States Army, right? So Thomas was sent out west because Stanton wanted to get rid of him. They didn't like
I believe that.
And Edwin Stanton had the ability to send a guy, on an important mission, but to get him out of his hair. And he thought that Thomas would fail because Thomas was also a vehement racist. But little did he know that Thomas would take this, Lorenzo Thomas, I should say, would take this to heart. And he would come out here, and I don't know if there's anybody more important than racist Lorenzo Thomas than organizing the initiative for the United States Colored Troops. So there's so many paradoxes in the American Civil War where you're like, this dude who did not believe that these people were actually equal makes it his career.
That's not even the first paradox on this episode. We already acknowledged that John Pemberton is a loyal Union guy.
Well,
all right. Well, started that way, right? Emotionally.
Right. At least as an Army officer. But what I would say though is, and we'll talk about this on the back end of this conversation, but there's nobody. I would say that when Pemberton committed, he committed it all, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But he commits to the Confederate war effort, and there's a myth that he surrendered Vicksburg and that was it. That's a perpetuated myth. Not the case at all. Pemberton will remain in the Confederate service till the end of the Civil War.
We talk about Jefferson Davis in this same light. Like Jefferson Davis can lament all the secession he wants, the saddest day of his life. When he's in, he is Mark Davis. He is like or Al Davis, whoever owns the Raiders then and now. It's just win, baby. He is all in.
Yeah, exactly.
He probably had a better haircut than Mark Davis.
Yeah, I mean, he's got probably the most unusual one. I wish that I could say it was like a 90s bowl cut, but it's just hideous.
Dude, Mark Davis's hair is weird. Matt has no idea what we're talking about.
Not even a little.
After the show, I'm going to Google it for him. And even Matt Borders, non-sports fan, will be like, oh, Jesus, get a better haircut.
I mean, to be completely honest, it's one of the things that I every now and again just to laugh. It really, like you could make a meme without even writing anything on the picture and still laugh. That's how great it is. But
all right, that is something special.
I just showed it to him. So real time, he saw the haircut.
And that dude's worth how much money?
Like $1 bajillion at this point. I think he's a legitimate billionaire.
Yeah, he's a billionaire. So just goes to show you that you don't need fashion or hair people.
No, your dad just needs to own the Oakland, now Vegas Raiders. That's all. It's a small, humble $1 million loan, you know.
But so let's get into this and what they do. So Grant is stuck in the mud, if you will, on the west side or the west bank of the Mississippi River in Louisiana. He starts to look at a variety of different options, one of which is actually digging a canal across the DeSoto Peninsula, which is directly across from Vicksburg. So that hairpin turn comes around and forms a peninsula, and they're basically digging at the base of this peninsula a canal to bypass Vicksburg. Now, that canal had been prosecuted during Admiral, or I keep saying Admiral, but at the time, Flag Officer David Farragut, when he arrived in Vicksburg, he arrived with an Army force under Thomas Williams. And we would claim him as a Michigander, even though he wasn't born there. He called Detroit his hometown, and he is in charge of, I think, a little over 3,000 federal soldiers, and almost to the man. They're New Englanders and Easterners. Vermont, men from Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine. There is one Michigan unit, the 6th Michigan Infantry, which became a heavy artillery unit, but they're left in Baton Rouge. But these guys are brought to actually dig this canal with freed slaves. And they start digging the canal dead in the middle of, right now, man. Right now, they're digging this campaign in 1962. They're digging this canal campaign. They're digging this canal through the peninsula, and they immediately start getting sick. These guys are not used to the climate, mosquitoes, disease, poor water. So hundreds of slaves getting ill and dying. And of course, hundreds of these soldiers start getting ill and dying very quickly. Within weeks, Williams' brigade of 3,000 goes from that to about 800. That's how many guys got sick, many of them dying.
Dude, when I was in Vicksburg that one summer, I was there towards the end of July. Right. It was brutal. We're in the mid-Atlantic, right? So we have humidity. There is nothing like that combination I've experienced in this country other than Orlando, Florida, which is its own experience in weather. But dude, by the way, along the river, very nice. the moment you step into anywhere that the river breeze doesn't hit you, you have just walked into hell. Like Vicksburg is, it's a blast furnace. It is hot. It is humid. You can't escape it, and everything bites you down there.
Right.
I think I got 30 mosquito welts in about 6 hours of being on the field. It was devastating.
Right. Yeah, it's well, and the thing you tell as terrible as that is, if people want the experience that the soldiers were going through, other than fire ants, because they were not on this continent at the time period of the Civil War, every other experience you're going to get by being here, humidity, heat. By the way, our 4th of July weekend that we've planned so many great events this upcoming weekend, triple digits. I was like a shotgun blast to my heart, man. I was like,
we're getting blasted up here right now. Like I can't even imagine how you're getting blasted.
We're feeling for you, buddy.
Right. It's going to be brutal, but we're going to work with it. But so Grant starts to figure out all these things. A couple different canals, a couple different bayou expeditions. They're all failing. Everything he's attempting is failing. So more failure for Grant, right? And Lincoln is trying him longer, and he's still failing, right? But
is it because he's trying? Is it because he's keeps trying?
Well, Grant would tell you in his memoirs that there's a reason why he prosecuted all these attempts to keep his army active. However, if you read his letters, if you read everything that's going on, we understand that you do have to keep an army active, because they are dying. If you keep them in a camp in a levee, they're going to just keep dying. But the back end of that is he was hoping that any one of these things, if it worked, who cares? If I bypass Vicksburg, it's obsolete. Who cares? And I did it bloodlessly. So whatever. Yeah, we lost some men from disease. That's happening throughout the war anyway. But beyond that, I mean, I successfully did my job. I made Vicksburg obsolete. We'll open the river up and we'll take, call it a day.
I bet you Lincoln is also trying him longer because he is trying. Like he's doing something in a world where a lot of people are, what do we say? Ain't doing shit. Like he's doing stuff. Like he's out there slinging the mud. It's not working, but he's trying something.
Right. Exactly. And the case of futility with this canal business across the river is he's talking to his engineers and they're like, it's not going to work. It's just not going to happen. The river won't deposit the water the way it's supposed to go in there. The Confederates have fortified several batteries at what will be the mouth or exit of this canal. It's just not going to work. But Lincoln finds out about this canal and loves the idea. Oh, bypass Vicksburg, bloodless campaign. And so he wants reports from Grant about the success or where are you at with this canal? And so Grant has to, for not just a couple weeks, but for 2.5 months, dig a canal he knows isn't going to work because the president of the United States, his boss, ultimately wants it to work. And so he's doing things like that, which I will tell you is Grant now in 1863 is becoming politically savvy. He's understanding that this is what the president wants. I'm going to make this happen while I work on all these other things, all these other moving parts. So he's starting to become politically savvy at this point. But at the same time, he is trying different things, all of which fail. And we talk about Grant's 3 options. In March of 63, everything has failed or about to. And he has 3 options. The first option he has is to take his army and retreat back up the Mississippi River to Memphis and ultimately conduct the same military operation that he did in 1862, which is ultimately follow the Mississippi Central Railroad to Jackson with a long logistic line of supply and communication. That he could try that, but ultimately, if you go back up the river, that's an admission of defeat, and he would lose his job, and he knows that because he's already been given a chance. And if he does this, he'll be dismissed or just removed from command. The second option is direct assault at Vicksburg at some point, much like Chickasaw Bayou. At some point, he just takes his army, an amphibious landing, they test the guns of the defenses of Vicksburg. He knows he'll take horrific casualties, but he could potentially take the city and accomplish the mission and objective. But no matter if he captures Vicksburg or not, if it's a bloodbath, he's going to lose his job. So those are those 2 options. The third option is potentially march his army down the levee system on the west bank of the Mississippi River. Coordinating with the United States Navy in a joint military operation, he will get the Navy to run the gauntlet of the batteries defending the river section of Vicksburg, and ultimately get as many ironclad gunboats in transport south of the city to enable his army to cross. And as we are aware, in hindsight, ultimately, looking at all of his options, that's the one that he chooses. And he will, at the end of March 1863, start sending messages and getting together with Acting Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, who's in command of the Mississippi Squadron. He had been put in command at the same time period that Grant was put in command of the Army and the department. And he's been working with Porter throughout the winter and now into the spring of 63. And basically Porter's game. And the thing we want our the viewers or listeners, if you will, to remember is that Porter outranks Grant by rank. He didn't have to do anything. And we know the Navy and the Army historically are oil and water. They just don't mix. There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of animosity. And Porter is one thing that Gideon Wells wrote in his diary is that ultimately Porter takes risks, and we're now watching him take a risk, and he sends a message back to Grant that says, I will absolutely 100% run my gunboats past the gauntlet of the batteries of Vicksburg, but once they go below the city, they cannot come back. And this is a risk that Grant is going to have to take, and he's willing to do it at this point, which tells you about his character. He's willing to either it's an all or nothing. It's a zero-sum game for Grant right now. Either I'm going to capture Vicksburg or get destroyed and destroy my army in the process. But either one thing or the other is going to happen.
I'd love to take a look at David Dixon Porter on this show at some point, because I'm familiar with him from an entirely different perspective. Right. And so, like, my family has very strong ties to Cape Hatteras. Like, I personally have a 252 telephone number. Like, we're linked down there. The whole reason that Hatteras got a lighthouse down there was because David Dixon Porter went on an exploratory committee in the 1850s and was like, yo, this shoal system is exactly what they say. It's a killer. You need a light down here. So, like, even though the one you visit today is not that physical one, but just the fact that there is a light there is entirely related to his recommendation that, I think at that time he was just a lieutenant, but he got down there and was like, dude. And honestly, you learn a lot about him in that experience, that relates to this moment and risk. Like he spoke very in that, I guess, decision to really put forward this idea for the lighthouse. He kind of just went around certain people and things like that. And I'm not an expert on, so I don't want to dive too deep into it, but you kind of get the impression, even as a younger man, he understands risk and reward and which ones to take and which ones not to. So kind of hearing this moment in 1863, which is like a whole decade after I first encountered him, it's like, hey, you recognize the guy. Right. A mature version probably, but you recognize certain things about him.
Right.
And he's such a fascinating person.
I'm a huge fan of the Brown Water Navy too, especially the city class ironclads. I love those things. And the fact that he uses them so well and is willing to risk them. They're not just these really important, very expensive little toys. He's using them. And of course, my personal favorite, the Karen Dillette, and all the work she does on the river.
Right, exactly. And to plug Vicksburg's military park here, they have the only intact ironclad gunboat from the American Fourth, Cairo. And to plug Porter and his open-mindedness is that the Lieutenant Commander Thomas O. Selfridge Jr., who had his bad luck at Hampton Roads early on in the war, in command of the Cairo in December of 62, clearing torpedoes or river mines out of the Yazoo River in preparation for Sherman's amphibious landing on December 12th, 1862. The Cairo hits one of those or two of them potentially, and caves in the bottom. They were galvanically detonated, and that gunboat's lost in 12 minutes. Well, of course, Selfridge and the crew go back up the river, and they meet Porter coming down the river on the Black Hawk, and they board the boat, or Selfridge boards the boat, and he's thinking he's going to lose his commission, he's going to be out of the Navy, and Porter's basically like, you took a risk and you did it. I'm not going to censure any Navy officer for doing his duty you were doing your job. Now I'm going to send you up to Cairo and give you a new command, and you're going to continue to do that. And ultimately, sidebar, but Selfridge gets the USS Conestoga, and he's down south of Vicksburg siege, and it's rammed by another ship and it sinks. So he's on 3 boats that sink during the war: the Cumberland and Hampton Roads, the Cairo and the Yazoo River, and just south of the Big Black River. Conestoga. Dude's got bad luck. He's also friends with Tsar Alexander II, the one that's eventually disposed of.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So anyway, I believe the Cairo and one of the very first true battle studies of your site were all linked by the same individual.
Yep.
Legendary Ed Bars. I never got that right. Just the man. Just call him Ed. That dude was the man. But yeah, I think I know he wrote like one of the first or the first study
he did
at Monocacy, but
interpretive study.
But he championed the I think how he's integral to the Cairo's recovery, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The first story I'll say is we had just bought our house here in Vicksburg, and I got a phone call. I think it was it was my day off. It must have been like 3:30, and I was just sitting. I'm sitting literally where I'm sitting right now, and my phone goes off, and they said, "Hey, Ed's up at the Cairo right now." And I think I drove about as fast as I possibly drive through the city of. And I get there. There's Terry Winchell and Ed, and they're kind of milling around. They're kind of just milling about, and they got this group. And I wasn't too familiar with Terry yet, and I certainly had never met Ed before, and even in all the places that I had worked, and I was just thunderstruck. You're watching somebody, to quote another Ranger that's a good friend of mine, that's seen Ed a ton. He said he's got an unusual brain. He sits there and he'll talk, and then when it's time for him to discuss the war, it's like a light switch going on, and it's just there, and he's there, and he's giving you so much detailed and intimate information that it's hard not to be, romantic about the war. And anyway, and Ed's interpretation is an older version of what we would interpret the war, but there's just, you're watching this person that is larger than life tell you the stories, and he's telling the story of something that he did. It's not just traipsing the battlefield of Perryville or Gettysburg or wherever you're on a tour with Ed. He's standing in front of one of the greatest artifacts that has ever been found, and he found it, and his story of finding it is unreal. So for those listeners that don't know it, we won't go into the story, but go find the story of how Ed found the Cairo and the fascinating. But he was the first historian that was placed. He got into the National Park Service. This was his first duty station, and he chose to stay in Vicksburg when he was made the regional historian of the Southeast region of the National Park Service, because he, much like Pemberton, married a local Southern lady here as long as he could until they ended up in Alexandria, Virginia, which is where he lived. But I got to meet Ed several times, and after that, and every single time he showed me or told me something that just blew my mind. And
absolute legend
for anybody that's had the opportunity to listen or meet him. Just a great guy. And one of my favorite pictures is me standing there with him, and I'll tell a story offline about that because it's not
well, then getting back on track, as you were talking about Selfridge getting on 3 ships that sank, I was thinking we've also talked about somebody getting on 3 ships that sank. We've talked about Violet Jessup, not related to this story at all, but she is the only person I think that has credit for surviving Titanic, Britannic sinkings, and when Britannic was struck by the Hawk, I think she's on that. So she's on all of those. So, I don't know. Maybe they're related. Don't get on a ship with Selfridge. Don't get on a ship with Jessup. That's what I've learned now.
Right. Yeah, they're related, or just they keep in the same company, whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah, they drink the same water, but either way, don't get on ships with those people. So, all right. So Cairo goes down, new ship, all that stuff. Conestoga goes down.
Right. So we're here where the campaign. I mean, the campaign going to begin at the end of March 31st, 1863. Tasked with the important assignment, John A. McClernand's 13th Army Corps initiates the vanguard of marching down the levees, repairing the roads, corduroying the roads, bridging the broken portions of the levee, and marching south below Vicksburg on the Louisiana side. In the middle of April 16th, the gunboats will run the gauntlet under, the lead gunboat, the Black Hawk, with Porter at the lead. Those gunboats and transports will run the gauntlet. Only one, the Henry Clay, is destroyed. The rest of them get repaired, and they're now below the city. And this is the point where we say that tactical advantage, maybe that illusion, if you will, that the Confederates held this dominant location for what the Confederacy had dubbed the Gibraltar of the Confederacy.
Right.
They had dubbed Columbus, Kentucky before that the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. So you can see as these places get captured, they continuously look for that biblical.
They're like, look, it wasn't. I didn't mean that Gibraltar. It's this
right,
Gibraltar.
Right. No, that's not really. I think you misheard me. Yeah, that was kind of like. There was a smudge on the book. It's actually in 50 years from now. But this Gibraltar is now bypassed, and then the Federal Navy runs several more transports on April 22nd, predominantly manned by infantrymen, and they run the gauntlet. They get enough transports and gunboats below the city that tactical advantage shifts from the Confederates that dominate this location to Grant can now cross the river anywhere he wants to, and the Confederates, they can't even get correctly with a stroke of luck. But the Confederates had already started to prepare defenses at a location south of Vicksburg called Grand Gulf. It was another bend in the river that they fortified. They put in command Brigadier General John S. Bowen, and he's down there with his crack Missourian and Arkansans, arguably the best combat troops in Pemberton's army, and they're defending Grand Gulf. And so ultimately, when Grant bypasses that Vicksburg, he's looking first at this little town of Warrenton just south of Vicksburg, but then finally decides that Grand Gulf will be the place that he will cross his army. And he ultimately needs Porter, who he's worked very well with in this joint military operation, to effectively neutralize Grand Gulf's two major forts, Fort Coburn and Fort Wade. And so April 29th, 1863, They assault the location. They do neutralize Wade, but they cannot knock out Fort Coburn. And ultimately, it's just too strong for the Navy. The Navy gunboats take just a licking. They are tons of casualties. I mean, the decks are spattered with blood, and they just can't take it. Grant's men, predominantly from McClernand's Corps, are on these transports, waiting to cross the river to assault by force when they disembark and they continue their march further south from Hard Times Landing to Disharoon Plantation. And it's at Disharoon Plantation that word gets back from a slave that had been on the roads on the east side, in the Mississippi side of the river. And they bring that slave to the west bank and they question him. And he says that there's a good road leading from Bruinsburg up onto, from the river, the low riverside, up the embankment onto flat, dry ground where there's plenty of ample location for the armies to effectively march. And of course, he's questioned, are there any Confederates nearby? And there's no Confederates closer than Grand Gulf. And so Grant determines that on April 30th, he will start to cross the Mississippi River with those gunboats and transports. For those Hoosiers that may be listening, it's Indianans that cross first, and they are the first to touch their boots onto the ground of Mississippi soil to initiate what will be the great campaign to capture Vicksburg. From April 30th, throughout the day, soldiers are transported back and forth. Thousands of federal soldiers under John A. McClernand are first deposited and ultimately need to be refitted with ammunition and food before they begin their precarious march up the escarpment and onto the dry ground in front of the Windsor Plantation and Bethel Church. At night, these guys are still crossing. Grant wants to hold his entire force he has on hand, both the 13th and 17th Army Corps. He wants them all to cross. But ultimately, as night shrouds the river, two boats collide. The loss of the second, got to remember the battery, 2nd Illinois Light Artillery, Battery F, loses the horses, limbers, and guns. And the commander of that was Captain John Wesley Powell, if we were familiar with that particular name. First white man to navigate, or considered the first white man, obviously, to navigate the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, that with his one arm that he lost at the Battle of Shiloh. He loses his entire with the loss, I believe, of the Horizon. But that suspends the crossing operations. They will again be initiated at daylight on May 1st. But enough troops have crossed the river. They are now up and on high ground. Eventually, they will begin to march up the road systems. They'll arrive just south of Port Gibson. They will initiate that battle. McClernand will actually be fighting on two roads, the Rodney and Bruinsburg Road, effectively pushing the Confederates, who put up a strong, determined delaying action, especially as Bowen arrives on the field and he starts to feed in as many troops as he can. But ultimately, Pemberton failed to reinforce Bowen because of the illusion that the Union Army was feinting to the south, and their real objective was the Chickasaw Bayou battlefield. And they really believe that that's where the Union Army will disembark and try to take Vicksburg because it's closer. And Grant was smart enough to understand that perception, and he sent Sherman with men under the 15th Army Corps to do just that. And it must have been shameful for Sherman coming back to that battlefield that he had been so bluntly repulsed, 6 months prior to. And here he is now arriving with those same veterans of that battle to disembark and put together their own feint to deceive the Confederates, which works masterfully. Pemberton does not commit reinforcements in time, and ultimately that dooms Bowen at Port Gibson. At the same time period, I would be remiss if I did not say that there's two cavalry operations happening. Grierson's raid is running roughshod and distracting Pemberton. Nothing distracted Pemberton and the Confederate authorities in Mississippi more than Grierson's raid. I would say equally as important would be Straight's raid. The mule riders riding through northern Alabama are equally as important as they pull Nathan Bedford Forrest and his veteran cavalry, and he chases them and not Grierson. I would also be remiss and so self-indulgent if I didn't say that I'm a descendant of Straight's raiders.
There you go.
My ancestor was ultimately captured by Forrest in Cedar Bluff, Alabama, but he was a key part in that distraction that ultimately I can say was successful in the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi.
There you go. Excellent.
But there's my shameless plug. So once this battle unfolds, the Confederates retreat into this corridor. They are now bottling themselves up on the kind of northwestern part of the Big Black River and the Mississippi River. And ultimately, that's where they're going to remain as Grant first crosses Little Bayou Pierre. He refits. He actually bathes in the Mississippi, the first bath he's taken in several days. He changes his clothes. He gets Sherman to eventually cross at Grand Gulf. He has his army with him. And now from that point of time, and I'll just say from the date of the battle, May 1st, all the way up through, we'll say May 17th and May 18th, he prosecutes a masterful campaign where he really deceives the Confederates. He constantly feints McClernand's corps to think that they're going to cross the Big Black River at different points. He gets his army in a position to cut the rail line at Clinton, Mississippi. He fights. Well, McPherson's corps fights the battle at Raymond. They eventually capture the state capital in Jackson, Mississippi, and ultimately, fan favorite right there.
Right.
It's the battle at Champion Hill on May 16th, 1863. And ultimately, this is the decisive battle because Pemberton, who is indecisive by nature, realizes he has to act. And he pulls 22,000 defenders out of the Vicksburg corridor, crosses the Big Black River, and ultimately doesn't know what to do. He puts together a council of war. He listens to his subordinates, which doesn't really, I would say, evict a lot of confidence in Pemberton amongst his subordinate officers. And ultimately, his decision is that they're going to go down to a location to try to disrupt Grant's supply line. And he gets caught with his army strung along the road system around the Champion plantation along the hills there, and fights this battle where Grant is on the battlefield watching as everything is taking place, adapting to the situation as masterfully as he does throughout any other battles and throughout the rest of the war, and ultimately just destroys Pemberton's army on the field and forces them to retreat to a defensive position along the Big Black River, for which the next day, in a very, very short battle, less than 50, the Confederates are effectively pushed across the river, and they are running pell-mell back to Vicksburg.
Is Champion Hill, when I visited the battlefield, the World War I looking part of the battlefield, like with all the crazy terrain in the hills?
No, that's the park itself. This is a core group of ridgeline and hill, and a portion of the battlefield that's about 15, 16 miles to the east of here, side of the Big Black River. The park required significant acreage of the battlefield, and it's waiting for the ownership of the actual hill itself. Then it was incorporated into the park. But with this army retreating now, we have to think of the mentality of the Union Army from Grant down. Everything they're seeing strewn along the roads leading to Vicksburg: weapons, cartridge boxes, belts, haversacks, boxes of food, horses, mules, artillery wagons, limbers, artillery, wounded soldiers, everything that an army needs to survive effectively has been cast aside to get back to the defenses. It doesn't take a general to realize that the Confederates are demoralized. And so that's the mentality of the Federal soldiers. Pemberton has a quote that the chief engineer, Samuel Lockett of this department, riding back with Pemberton, recorded something, and you can read this in Battles and Leaders. But Lockett wrote that Pemberton said, 30 years ago, I received and accepted my appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and started his military career. And now, today, that career has ended in disgrace and disaster. It gives you an idea of Pemberton's mentality. I mean, he's just watched in 2 singular days, in his first active military operation as a lieutenant general, and he's watched his army completely defeated, and because of that, his mentality going back to Vicksburg, he's distraught. But it's kind of a tale of two things. They get back to the defenses. He's distraught. The civilians in the city are now concerned because they're watching all these demoralized soldiers come back, saying that Pemberton has sold them out, and that he's a traitor, and that half the army's left on the battlefield as prisoners or killed. And the people of Vicksburg are beside themselves listening to all this stuff. They're incredibly concerned. There's several diarists. Emma Balfour, whose famous diary tells us about basically Sherman's army arriving at Chickasaw Bayou, is now like, I'm seeing all these officers and men come in, and they're demoralized, and it was we were getting out of church, and now we're the bells are tolling, and everybody's freaking out. Mary Loughborough, another diarist whose husband's a Confederate officer in the garrison, is now writing about what she's dealing with, and watching this army come in and basically taking any food and anything they could get their hands on, and the situation is incredibly chaotic. And then the Union Army arrives. So it's right. It's not even these are the Confederate soldiers that are coming and freaking everybody out and basically setting the stage for what's going to happen. And then the Union Army actually arrives, and they're looking at the Union Army as this horde of evil soldiers that are going to come and destroy them all. But May 19th, Sherman assaults the defenses along the Graveyard Road, and ultimately they are bloodily repulsed very quickly on that sector of Grant's line as he's starting to envelop and surround the city. And at that point where Pemberton, his officers, and the soldiers that did participate in the battles outside of the defenses start to regain their composure, and they really start to realize that the defenses are strong, that Lockett put together one hell of a defensive line, utilizing the broken terrain, the highest terrain possible, 2 miles outside of the city, and anything in front of the defensive positions is just nasty, broken, chalked with natural Mississippi cane. The Confederates have toppled any trees and obstructions they can into the ravines, the abattis, if you will. It's just a formidable position for which Sherman, testing his one location along the Graveyard Road, finds out 15 minutes. The assault has failed, and now the men are trapped until darkness, and that's May 19th. But the mentality, Grant, his soldiers, is that the failure for that location at that time period was very simple. It was an isolated attack, and the Confederates reinforced the position. And so if Grant assaults the entire Confederate siege line as best as he can, 3 3/4 mile front, somewhere the Confederates will break. Because remember, they're so demoralized, but the mentality has already started to change with Sherman's failure. But Grant still believes that demoralization is just run rampant and that somewhere they'll break through. And so on May 22nd, 1863, he assaults at 10 a.m. They assault the positions, and there's a little bit of headway made on McClernand's front, but ultimately they are bloodily repulsed. And within those 2 days of assaults, Grant takes 4,000 casualties and makes zero headway. I mean, it's just a bloodbath for him. And ultimately, another failure for Grant, right?
Well,
Total failure.
People point to Grant at Cold Harbor as an example.
Right.
Even though that's been undergoing a lot of interesting reassessment the past few years. The fact of the matter is that when Grant writes in his memoirs, he's talking about this assault on the 22nd and Cold Harbor as being the two attacks he regretted most during the war.
Right. Well, and there's no doubt about it because of the horrific loss of life. I mean, it's I had to put the lights on because I realized I was shrouded in darkness and I couldn't see anything.
That's a theme on the podcast here. We have had, I think you are now the third different guest, and then 4 if you include our host who has done this a few times, who has faded into the darkness as the sun sets on the pod. I literally think our very, very first guest on the show, we did a follow-up with them, and I think at some point they faded into the darkness and they were like, oh, I should turn the lights on.
I honestly thought you'd lost power, but
you know what?
Oh, I mean, we were almost there earlier when we were talking. I was looking at the clouds. I was like, oh no.
Yeah, no. It's a thing. We do history in the dark. We do history after dark. It's
right.
We're cool.
Right. I love that. But yeah, I mean, to the point, it is a bloodbath. I mean, the casualty lists run long, and again in the newspapers up north in the Midwest or the old Northwest, there's the people are seeing, and for what? But Grant already initiated his siege operations. When they arrived, they started digging in, and that starts to happen full scale. He starts to request engineering officers because his army doesn't have that many. In fact, anybody that had any engineering experience prior to the war is immediately tapped as an engineer, including several guys that are tapped as chief engineers of Army Corps. I mean, the number one I can think of being Captain Andrew Hickenlooper, who was an artillery captain that fought at his battery was fighting viciously at the Battle of Shiloh, and the famous story of his father arriving on the battlefield. He's now the chief engineer of the 17th Army Corps, of prosecuting the siege approaches and effectively all the parallels and everything that needs to happen in the siege operations. But this is the time period. One thing happens between the end of the assaults and really all of the siege operations that start to happen, and it's a truce on May 25th, where the Confederates were so aghast at the smell and sight of all the Union dead in front of their fortifications that finally Pemberton requests a truce, for which Grant would not initiate it. There were several communications saying, "Hey, it's getting pretty bad. Don't you want to come bury your dead?" And he will not acknowledge any of that. But does acknowledge Pemberton's request for a truce to enable his soldiers to bury the Union dead. And it also enables those, that quintessential time and time again of Union and Confederate soldiers intermixing and that those Americans talking to Americans and people finding friends between on the opposing sides and that quintessential story that happens as the burial parties are digging and burying the shallow graves of the dead on the battlefield. These guys are chatting amongst each other. And people like, enterprising engineers like Andrew Hickenlooper walk right up to the Confederate defenses and look down into them and go, this is what you got going on in here, which is exactly what many of the Confederate high command were worried about with this potential truce. And it happens. I mean, the guys walking into the Confederate lines are like, oh, that's what, hey, you got you got a fortification connected by trench line going over there, and it's okay. Yeah,
I won't remember this. Don't worry. When we go back to doing this for real, I won't remember that.
Right.
I just was enjoying the way that I think I was like you were describing Grant, not acknowledging and not initiating this truce. And it's kind of I have this way that I interpret Grant that is probably very far from the reality of who he is. But I always talk about Grant as if he was just like, yeah, deal with it kind of guy. And so it's like, oh, my dead are bothering you? Bury him.
Right.
You bury him.
Right.
And it's like, I kind of, as you were describing that, I was like, he might not speak that directly, matter of factly, but the sentiment might have been there. He's like, you got a problem with it? You put him in the ground.
I mean, if we're being completely honest, it goes back to, his commandant when he was at West Point was Charles Smith, who eventually becomes a subordinate officer under him in the Western Theater, right? And Grant asked Smith what he thinks the terms of surrender at Donelson which should be, and it's Smith that goes, don't
no terms.
They don't get anything. Unconditional surrender rights. And so it's like he sort of gets this gruff personality from Smith, but I think you're absolutely right. I do think that any admission of acquiescing any request would be an admission of failure or weakness or something to that. I'm not the weak one. I am the person that surrounded you. You want to ask something from me, I'll consider it. But until then, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do. I have command of the situation and I will not relinquish it. And certainly he was not going to relinquish it to a guy like John Pemberton, who he ultimately figured out very early on. He's like, no, I'm not going to allow this to happen. Vital information comes from that truce. And for the weeks that precede that time period, first along really Sherman's and McPherson's Corps, they progressed these approach trenches, these zigzagging approaches cut by parallels for sharpshooting. And I mean, the soil disposition here in Vicksburg is Lurch soil. It's fine. It's not like we have in the east or north it's unusual. It's windblown sediment. And these guys that were like, oh my God, it's going to take us months to progress this engineering feat. It's weeks. It's so fast they're beside themselves. And really the delays in proper engineering officers and good, to be honest, good commanders. Some of the guys that arrived, McClernand is not a good administrative officer. He doesn't progress his part of the engineering operations early enough. And then some of the other officers like Jacob Lauman in charge of a sector of the line, he does nothing. And it's to the point where like they start sending engineering officers down to him and be like, you need to start doing something, which effectively prolongs the engineering operation along the entire siege lines. But it is an engineering feat. It's a digging operation. Their ultimate objective is to create 13 different approaches, and each approach or zigzagging trench will eventually reach a Confederate defensive position, and a gallery will be dug underneath, for which black powder will be placed under it. And as you're familiar with the crater at Petersburg, this is effectively what that's going to be on a full scale. Now, as the weeks go on to up to June 22nd, along Hickenlooper's sector of the Jackson Road, they effectively dig their galleries. They supplant 2,200 pounds of black powder. The Confederates are aware of what's going to happen because the digging effectively is stopped. There's the Mississippians digging in a countermine. 3:30 in the afternoon, June 25th, boom, the 3rd Louisiana Redan blows up along the Jackson Road, and there's a 25-hour battle of really endurance. And it is similar to that Battle of the Crater, if you think Cold Mountain in that movie. But these regiments are jumping into this crater. They're fighting hand to hand. There's Confederate units jumping in. The grandson of Henry Clay, Andrew Eugene Irwin, who's the colonel of the 6th Mississippi, charges into the fray. He's immediately killed. The great grandson of the great compromiser, that the man that was trying to stave off Civil War, is killed in the crater. There's a lot. It's just a bloodbath, and the Federals are eventually, through sheer exhaustion and casualties, pushed out of it. But they prosecute another mine there on July 1st, and ultimately Grant comes up with the time frame is perfect for him because he sets the date. July 6th, all 13 of those mines will be detonated, no matter what. And all 13 locations, federal soldiers will be literally forcing their way in and taking Vicksburg by storm. We are ending this now.
Are we having a World War One conversation right now? Like literally, like the way you're talking about mines, counter mines, zigzagging, so that we have sharpshooter and blast defenses. We have a specific date where multiple mines. I'm thinking like Messines Ridge, right? Like 1916. Exactly. I'm sorry, 1917, where they're going to blow all the mines at once. First of all, we know that doesn't happen because, spoiler, we know this story ends before that. But so one or two, whatever, I forget the count. When I went to this battlefield, this was one of my favorite parts of the battlefield, the Redan part. If correct me if I'm wrong, and strong chance I am, if you've been listening to this show for a long time. My favorite perspective of this, it looks like on the backside, maybe down a hill, there's like a sap trench looking thing, and part of it's covered, but it kind of goes right up to the backside of this. Is that the right part of the battlefield? Because this is by the big, what is it, the Illinois Monument? It's up there.
Right.
Is that like sap trench looking thing? Is that a Confederate dig trench for cover that's covered, or is that a Union little sappy looking trench?
If you're talking about the back end of their fortification, obviously because it is a Redan, it would be naturally have been open in the rear to facilitate troop movement and artillery movement, because they had two pieces of artillery in that particular location. But what the Confederates had realized, and predominantly the 3rd Louisiana, the veteran regiment that had been in that particular fortification, is they knew what was happening. They could hear the digging. They knew that the Federals had progressed all the way up to the location they're underneath. So what they ended up doing was building a gorge wall or a defensive line to complete that triangular shape, and ultimately they retreated behind it, and that was their fortified positions, because they knew that the mine would be detonated at some point, and ultimately it is, and that really kind of like Mahone's soldiers at the crater. They're there and they're like, oh my God, this thing just went off. But once that shock kind of staves itself off, they're turkey shooting, man, and it's basically a similar thing. The 3rd Louisiana takes cover, the mine goes off, and then they jump onto that gorge wall, and they're ready. They're there because they understand that the Federals are about to assault, and that assault takes place, and that's the 6th Missouri comes up over to really just stall out that Federal force and make sure that they don't manipulate the situation by any means. And it's this back and forth. Union units pulled out, another one's pulled in. They're trying to shoot their way around. A lot of fused shells are being lobbed back and forth like hand grenades. I mean, it really is very similar to what will be progressed in the First World War. There's no doubt about it. This is really the true testing ground for engineering operations and just trench or siege warfare. But it fails, and much like many of siege operations, trench operations, they're stagnated operations. They're slow. Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, they're boring, and the only other thing that's happening is sharpshooting, and that does take place. One of the most colorful figures of the sharpshooters is Coonskin Henry Foster, who was an officer in the 23rd Indiana, and he took rails from the Southern Railroad of Mississippi, and he built a tower just in front of the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and he took a weapon and a mirror. And he wore a coonskin hat like Davy Crockett, which is how he got his name. But he would hold that mirror up just like you would in you see in those trench movies in the First World War. He'd hold that mirror up, and a Confederate would pick his head up just enough to look, and he would rise up and fire and wound or kill them. And that's the type of warfare that's going on in this really stagnated situation, to the point where the Confederates, by late June, can't even lift their head above their parapets. They are literally trapped. They have nowhere to go. At this point, they're reduced in rations to the point where they have one piece of bread or pea bread. They have 1 cup of water and a small ration of meat. That's what they get for the day. So these guys have no sustenance. They are in the exposed open elements, which we are very aware, triple digits in Mississippi. And of course, across the nation, that June and July were the hottest on record. It's a nightmare scenario for them. And at this point where Grant determines on July 6th the Confederates on the back end are trying to figure out, can we break out? Can we actually get to Jackson, Mississippi, where Joseph E. Johnston, the Confederate general who's in command of the Western Theater, has arrived, and he's organizing a Confederate army, the Army of Relief, to come and save Vicksburg. And Pemberton's wondering, can we break out? Can we get through Grant's lines, march, and join up with Johnston? And eventually he will gather his ranking officers in his headquarters in the Willis House on Crawford Street, and he'll review some of the information he received. He'll ask them, is this something we could possibly do? And they all, almost to the man, say no. I think only one, Stephen D. Lee, the young brigadier.
We know him. We know him.
Should know that guy. He's a hothead, and he's like, we can do it. But it's only young, and any one of us at that time period with a couple stars on our collars or on our shoulders, we'd be like, hell yeah, let's do it. We'll make it happen. I don't care. But the cooler heads of the seasoned veteran officers just tell Pemberton straight up, can't do it. It cannot be done. The soldiers are so broken down in their health. We may be able to march, we may be able to fight, but we can't do both. And so ultimately what comes down, that's on July 1st. On July 2nd, Pemberton realizes that they're going to need to organize and figure out, we need to get terms and find out if what the terms would be for potentially surrendering the city. And he tasked John Bowen, that ablest combat commander that he has, the man that he's really relied upon throughout this particular campaign, of sound mind and judgment, very methodical. He realizes, through conversation, that Bowen had been a personal friend of Grant living in St. Louis, Missouri before the war. They had been friends and very intimate. And he hopes that intimacy between these two officers will potentially evoke some lenient terms in the surrender of the city and the army. So ultimately, Bowen will go. You got.
Yeah, I had a question for you real fast. As this is happening, right? This is obviously all happening very fast once you get to July 1st.
Right.
Are they aware that Lee is in Pennsylvania right now?
Well, that's a good question. I think that certainly the federal army is aware. I would have to look at the newspapers and the things that were being printed. They're still printing the daily the Vicksburg paper. I can't conclusively tell you that they know that or not. I'd like to say that they do. We know that Lee determines, what he's going to do at Gettysburg based on the fall of Vicksburg, and ultimately retreating, right? But they are aware that things are progressing throughout the country, and they're hopeful that something happens in their favor. Realistically, the majority of the soldiers, from the lowest private to Pemberton himself, hope and pray to God that Johnston will come. And
but they don't care about Lee. They're worried. They're wondering about Johnston.
Right. They know that Johnston is in Jackson, or the Jackson-Canton area anyway. They know that Confederates by the thousands have arrived by rail. And they are praying and wondering what's taking him so long. And it is a tragic thing to read the letters and diaries of the Confederate defenders of Vicksburg, in that false hope, that they are so down and out so quickly, mid-June. And they're like, Johnston's coming. He's got to come. We know he's coming. I'm praying to God he's coming. He's it. He's the savior. He's not coming. And, the reason why Pemberton makes the decision is he realizes at the end of June, he's like, he ain't coming. He's not coming. It's like, even if he does come, look where we're at. To me now, it's more a humanitarian effort. My men are so broken down that there's no point in even dealing with this anymore. The writing is on the wall. My military career, you thought it was over after Champion Hill and Big Black River. This is the death knell for his career. But it's a humanitarian effort for Pemberton, and he's going to do the right thing. He tasked his trusted subordinate John Bowen to go between the lines. It's almost comical. They go between the lines on July 2nd. It's Bowen and a guy named Colonel Lewis Montgomery, who was a staff officer under Pemberton. They go out on the Baldwin's Ferry Road, and Montgomery didn't unfurl the white flag. And so federal soldiers start immediately opening up on 2 Confederate officers on horseback in the middle of the road. I mean, they're getting shot. And basically Bowen and him ride back into the Confederate lines, and he basically, in so many words, tells them where to go: unfurl the damn flag and let's go back out there. And so the federal skirmishers, obviously seeing this, stop firing, bring him into the lines. They get to the tent of Stephen Burbridge, who'd been sick. They take him to William Landrum, a Kentuckian, a brigade commander. Andrew Jackson Smith. Smith receives Bowen. Bowen wants to immediately go see Grant, but obviously through military protocol, word is sent up to Grant's headquarters, for which Grant denies seeing his old friend John Bowen.
Whoa!
That's right. It's not. I mean, maybe Bowen thought it was. But they were really hoping that Bowen's former friendship would help these terms. But Grant is looking at the situation. The Confederates are sending an emissary to talk terms. I, as the department commander and the army commander, will only speak through proper military channels to the commander of the garrison of Vicksburg, John Pemberton, and John Pemberton alone. And this is where the situation becomes interesting, because Bowen, whether he knows it or not, is terminally ill with dysentery, and he's very sick. And he realizes that this has to end, that Vicksburg has to surrender. The civilians are suffering, the army's suffering, he's suffering. And so he plays a ruse, and he tells them to send a message back up to Grant that said, yeah, I know, but Pemberton wants to meet you between the lines at 3 p.m. tomorrow, July 3rd, to discuss the terms of surrender. And of course, Grant receives that information, and if Pemberton wants to meet me, then I'd be happy to meet with that particular commander at that appointed time. And now Bowen, receiving that, has to go back to the Willis house, Pemberton headquarters, and basically, tell him that that Grant refused to see me, he refused our terms, et cetera, et cetera. But, of course, and Pemberton was like, he was distraught. But he said that he wanted to see you between lines at 3 p.m. tomorrow to discuss the terms of surrender. For which, of course, Pemberton, who had an ego, he was a lieutenant general, and was not going to curtail to any particular statement, now thinks that Major General Grant wants to see him between Grant. Now Bowen is playing both. And so ultimately, through a flag of truce at 3 p.m. on July 3rd, 1863, the generals, Montgomery, Bowen, and Pemberton will ride out on the Jackson Road sector of the line. Grant has arrived with about as many general officers that want to be a part of this conversation. I mean, every general officer that had stars on his shoulder that could ride a horse made his way there. It was like, 8 or 9 generals.
That happens in 1865 too. There's a lot of people in the room for sure.
A moment in history, they're all keenly aware. And interestingly enough, the generals ride between the lines. The Confederates are standing on the ramparts of their fortifications, and of course the Federals are doing the same on their lines. Thousands of Federal soldiers observing this great meeting, and they all have a pretty good idea of what's going on. Pemberton and Grant shake hands. They're very cordial. We didn't mention this earlier. They had been staff officers together, I believe under the command of Major General William Worth during the Mexican War. And so they had known each other. I mean, again, we talk about how well, but they knew each other during the Mexican War. So they were fairly familiar. And of course, they had been prosecuting this campaign and this long siege. And so they have some very nice, pleasant formalities. And then they stand there very awkwardly looking at each other.
So you're going to give terms, or are you going to give terms?
By moment, Mad Magazine. Right? And ultimately, it's incredibly awkward. It's minutes and minutes and minutes. And finally, Pemberton initiates the conversation. I understand that you wanted to meet me to discuss the terms of surrender, for which Grant says, no, I didn't. Well, then I am under the misapprehension that you wanted to do that. I was misinformed. But since we're here, what would be the terms of surrender for the city of Vicksburg, for which Grant says, for which I have none, other than unconditional surrender? I have no terms. And of course, that enrages Pemberton. There will be many more dead Yankees on in front of the fortifications before you ever step foot into Vicksburg. He's enraged by that particular answer that Grant gave him. For which Grant, again, these great moments in Grant's military history, really realizes the situation at hand, and he actually says, let's let the staff officers discuss the terms. Why don't you and I actually detach ourselves from the situation and talk about the old times, talk about the Mexican War, talk about the old army. If you will believe in one person, they shared a demijohn of whiskey, whether that's true or not. But what they did do is they did remove themselves from the scenario, and they did discuss things other than the situation at hand, as the other ranking officers there tried to hash out the terms of surrender. Predominantly Bowen and
scene. Did they put this scene, Andrew, in the Grant documentary? Because I think they show a scene where he's basically sneaking a nipper of whiskey with. I think it's Pemberton, and they are not. They're like up on a ridge where they're not really a part of a. I think this scene is in that documentary.
Right. It would have to be, because it's one of the great moments in Grant's military career, and one that's unusual. We can talk about the Grant documentary. I mean, there's nothing more dagger in the heart than the fact that they never came to the park and filmed. It just that's not an official opinion. It's a personal opinion. When they're talking about Vic, just keep showing Fort Donaldson all the time. I'm like, oh my God. But
listen, our friend Avery is a part of that documentary, so for that we love it. Right. But outside of that documentary, aside from the fact that it sheds a good light on Grant in terms of the real man,
there's some real problems.
Big parts of that were garbage.
I complain, but then I feel bad for Shiloh and the Rangers up there, because there's scenes of Shiloh is like a pit soldiers are fighting, and Grant running through literally an African Sahara that's supposed to be Western Tennessee, and it like starting this thing and being really excited that the History Channel may have put money into doing something really good about Grant, and people saying it, that it's going to be good, and then watching it and being like he's riding through the Sahara like at full gallop. I'm like, oh God, I don't know if I could watch this. I've never
seen a column of 3 before in my entire life. Like, dude, what?
We're riding from the Cherry Mansion over the Mississippi or over the Tennessee River. We're gonna get there. Yeah, I'm just like, oh God. Anyway, so when Pemberton and Grant arrived back to that council, they could not agree upon the terms, for which ultimately Pemberton, through military protocol, said, Grant, I've asked for terms for what you haven't given me any. It's ultimately up to you to determine what those terms are going to be. And Grant acknowledges that. And so they break apart, and Pemberton and his staff will go back to his headquarters. Grant will ride to his headquarters, and for what in his memoirs he'll say it was really the only council of war I ever gave throughout the entire Civil War. But he wouldn't even admit that it was a council of war. He just gathered his officers there to listen to their opinions, et cetera, about what the terms should be. And the terms are ultimately that the army will be paroled, that they'll have the ability to march out. They'll stack arms, stack their banners. They'll be given wagons and food. Those terms are sent to Pemberton on July 3rd. And as he's mulling about, they try to counter with how we want to bring our servants, our slaves, and Grant's, nope, these are the terms. So ultimately, early in the morning of July 4th, Independence Day, as the Confederate Army had, and by the way, as Pickett's charge is really meeting that point when they're getting to, the stone wall. That's the point of time where Grant and Pemberton are meeting to discuss the fate of Vicksburg. So talk about
time,
right? I mean, they're interlinked, and they're not. I mean, they're singular events, and they're major catalysts to the end of the war, right? Like the shift is happening, and that all that transpires, and now Grant puts these terms together. So in the early morning hours of July 4th, Pemberton has no recourse. He's like, these are the most lenient terms we're gonna get. And ultimately, the message gets back to Grant early in the morning on July 4th. Fred Grant, his son, who had been on campaign with Grant throughout basically the entire time. And Fred writes in his memoir of his time with his father, the Vicksburg campaign, that his dad said, thank God Vicksburg has surrendered. You know, Fred was the first person to see and listen to his father basically say, you know, it's over. Finally,
I think Fred Grant gets wounded during the Vicksburg campaign just because he's in a bunch of places he shouldn't be as a young man.
Right.
And I think at one point he either gets directly hit or it takes like a shrapnel. But I think at one point he's wounded during this campaign.
Right. So he's at the Battle of Big Black River on May 17th. He's riding with Grant's chief of staff, Colonel Clark Lago.
Oh. Is it not Rollins? What is Rollins doing at this point, by the way? We didn't really talk about him.
I think you're right. Rollins is his chief of staff. So I'm trying to remember, maybe Lago is just a aide de camp at this point. I mean, but Lago had been with him even before I think Rollins had been with him. It doesn't matter. He's with Lago. Lago's now like the babysitter on the battlefield. But that's what it is. And so you have this older colonel and you have young Fred Grant, and a spent bullet hits Fred as they're riding on horseback, and he says, "My God, I'm killed," or something to that effect. He falls to the ground and he realizes it's just a bruise, and he was so embarrassed that he said that. He's like, you know, I get up off the ground and you know, I'm not killed, and that's a God, I'm killed, you know, as I hit the ground.
Andrew, you want to talk about what ifs, and one of the reasons we don't do them is because they lead you to places that they don't happen. But one of our favorite what ifs was how close we actually came in time to a legacy Grant general, in the sense that when Frederick Grant dies, I think in like 1911, he is like the second highest ranking general in all of our army. And when World War I comes around and Pershing gets command because the guy they want died, the next guy they want is dying or whatever. And so, but if you think about it, if Frederick Grant doesn't have, I think he dies of a heart attack or something, but like if he doesn't die in 1911, he's still a reasonably young man, late 50s, early 60s. Like Frederick Grant very likely would have been the commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France in World War I. Like, just when you think about that, it's like that we came so close to having General Grants running major wars in this country. And it's like, that's like, obviously it doesn't happen. But when you look at 1911, 1914, and 17, we get involved, it's like, wow, we were really close to that one.
Yeah. That's kind of like the fun history of linking some of the major events that start to happen. But of course, there's tons of Civil War veterans that end up somehow as ranking officers in the U.S. Army and the American Expeditionary Forces. And it's like it's almost it's kind of like the Spanish War. You see a lot of guys in the Spanish War. It's the same thing. Just because they did what they did early on. Hey, you were in the Civil War and you're still commissioned officer, so you're now going to go.
Yeah,
I mean, you're not going to
come on back
because you're still technically alive somehow, and you're still somehow commissioned in the Army, so you're going. Yeah. But ultimately, what happens is 10 a.m. July 4th, the Confederate Army marches out of their defensive works. They stack arms, they place their banners, and they march back in as prisoners. 17th Army Corps marches in victorious. The several flags will be placed above the old courthouse, that dominating feature on the Vicksburg River waterfront. The 45th Illinois and the 4th Minnesota Infantries will have their U.S. or national colors placed on top of there as a sign that the city has fallen. And it's a significant event. Lincoln sends Grant very quickly a message effectively saying that when you started this campaign, I did not believe that it would be successful. And I'm happy now to state that you were right and I was wrong. How many presidents, my God, would ever to a general in an active campaign that's just concluded been like, yeah, you were right. You were right.
I think the list is just him.
Right. Like, is his, that whole Honest Abe thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, most presidents just would have been like, cool, thank you, But
well done.
Well done. Abe's like, you actually were right about that. And Sherman writing in his memoirs, whether you believe in it or not, because I tend to not focus on a lot of the memoirs and the hindsight and all that stuff, because it's so easy for them to discount certain things that were major contributions and to fluff up things that just weren't necessarily what they were. But Sherman does write when they arrive at the Vicksburg front on the 18th of May, and they look down on the Federal soldiers marching to the Yazoo River to establish that supply depot, which was so crucial for Grant at that time period. because his army was on limited rations when they arrived at Vicksburg. That at that point they're sitting on horseback, and it's like, when you initiated this, I also didn't believe that this would be successful. But standing here looking at this, reestablishing our supply, whether we take Vicksburg or not, this was a successful military campaign. And so he's giving Grant where credit is due, even before they accomplished the goal and the objective of capturing the city. Now, take that for what it is, because he writes it in the 1880s or whenever completed his memoirs in early 1890s. I don't remember, but it's one of those moments where you're like, if that happened or not. Sherman and McPherson both sent letters to be sent to the War Department to say, we don't agree with how Grant is prosecuting this campaign. We're going to follow orders because we're good subordinate officers, but we literally wrote letters in writing saying that we vehemently disagreed with this, and look at the outcome. So chalk one up or end of the game, Hail Mary, chuck up and it's caught and Grant wins, or call it whatever you want.
Dude, I'm a Giants fan, Andrew. I know it doesn't matter. You can knock, and people did this for so long. They're like, yo, Eli's so derpy. I'm like, yeah, dude, but you know what? He hit David Tyree, he hit Plaxico Burress, and we won the game. It doesn't matter if at the end of the day the W is in the win column.
Right.
It's there.
You're right. And I was one of those people for a long period of time that watching the New England Patriots lose is and I hate to say this because I don't like to get into sports, because sports are more divisive probably at this point than politics or
almost.
And there's tons of listeners that are probably New England Patriots fans, but watching the Pats go down, I'm a New York Jets fan.
Well, I'm sorry for you, first of all.
Don't be sorry, man. I'm looking forward to every season is a rebirth, my friend.
Man, and it's a death. So I mean, you are a karmic existence as a Jets fan. We've been waiting since, for all of our Matt Borders listeners out there, I've been waiting since Namath. By the way, that was Super Bowl III, and we're in the freaking 50s now. It's been a while, but no. First of all, nobody in Boston listens to this show because I made it very clear that I root for the Yankees and I root for the Giants, and they know I'm a Rangers fan. So at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure that we are huge in actual England and not in New England. Fairly certain of that.
You got to figure out how to bypass the sports niche and fall in line with those. You just got to do something about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Everybody will fall in line. I mean, that's.
We've done some stuff on Maine, actually.
We have done Maine. We have both lifted up and crushed Chamberlain. We have an interesting relationship with New England here on the show. We'll tell you that. Go Yankees, though, for real.
Right. No, that's okay. I mean, like I said, my mother's family in time was from Maine. They had no involvement with the 28th Maine, but they are involved in the Civil War. But for Little Round Top, as somebody born in Michigan, the 16th Michigan doesn't get its cred, even though they do pull back. Norval Welch, call him for what he is, and of course he bites it at Poplar Grove or wherever he gets to go. But there's that regiment holding its own with only 250. Is a story against some hardened Texans that are coming up against them. So we won't get into the Gettysburg conversation either, but there's plenty.
Believe me, our listeners are getting their fill of Gettysburg with Scott Hartwig and Cody Aish right now. But so are they on July 4th in Vicksburg, aware of what has just happened in Pennsylvania now? Right.
So within a week, they're completely aware of the situation. And again, for the listeners, there's a lot of things that happen. July 4th, an inferior federal force is defending Helena, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. They defend over superior Confederate assaults. So the city of Helena is held on July 4th. So there's another one, July 4th. Vicksburg falls, which means ultimately, as we know, or for your listeners that don't know, Port Hudson is the last Confederate defense that falls on July 9th. But Vicksburg falls on July 4th. The Confederates' army has been effectively blunted, if you will, in their attempt to take the North in Pennsylvania. You have the Bloodless Tullahoma campaign, which has just been initiated at the end of June in Middle Tennessee. And
doesn't get enough credit either.
Exactly. And for those listeners that are interested, Dave Powell's book is great. about the Tullahoma campaign. But yes, it needs more publicity and how important it is and what starts to happen. And then, of course, for our Michiganders listening, Tebbs Bend, of course, that little in Kentucky with the 25th Michigan Infantry, Colonel Orlando Moore and his 5 or 6 companies, stopping John Hunt Morgan temporarily.
Punches Morgan right in the friggin' face.
Right. It's just a little Michigan love that
this is the most love Michigan the Mitten has ever gotten on this show.
Put me on
in this moment, man.
Very much so. Thank you.
But that being said, they become aware of what's happening. When I'll say this, I use Tullahoma as an opportunity because it's in between the East and what's happening here. And the soldiers in Rosecrans Army hear about Vicksburg almost immediately. I mean, they're firing 25 gun salvos, and the men are screaming, and they're realizing the impact that's potentially going to have. And then they get word also what happens in the East, and now their eagerness to prosecute the Tullahoma campaign and push the Confederates out of Tennessee is multiplied, because now they have all these events happening, and if they can continue to do what they're doing, they see the end of the war now. And of course we know what happened, but the dominoes, like we keep saying, are falling, and these soldiers in Middle Tennessee are prosecuting their own campaign of maneuver and pushing the Confederates out of Tennessee and into Georgia, which ends up, with Chickamauga and Chattanooga. But, for the point, once this city falls, the biggest thing I can say for your listeners is, like, so what? What happens? Why is Vicksburg important, right? The psychological effect would be the number one thing. We can talk about a variety of different things that happen because of the conquering of the Mississippi River, but it's the psychological effect that I will say, as a historian, has the number one effect across the South initially. With the fall of Vicksburg, with Lee's army, defeated, the Confederates being outmaneuvered out of Tennessee, but with the fall of Vicksburg, they were riding on their hopes that Vicksburg was the one thing that couldn't fall. Yeah, armies get defeated in battles, but Vicksburg is as strong as Gibraltar. They kept using that biblical word, and the Confederates there can hold out forever. And ultimately, Confederate armies will come and save them, and they'll continue to hold that city and hold the river, right? The river itself, essentially, the loss of it, again, is demoralizing in that psychological effect. That's the Mississippi River. That's the lifeblood, or the vertebrae, or the backbone of the country. It's the thing that connects all of us. The tributaries are, all these major rivers are just tributaries of the Mississippi River, right? The loss of that is catastrophic, right? Now, Albert Castell wrote an article basically dispelling the importance of Vicksburg realistically in the grand scheme of the war. And he goes through just a list of all the things historians have talked about, from those that just post-war to those modern historians at the time period. He wrote that article. I would say that he had an axe to grind for sure, because of course he's the historian of the Atlanta campaign, and
right.
There's no doubt that the Atlanta campaign is probably the most decisive in what happens at that time period of the war. But it's the psychological effect. It's the loss of the great river, the fact that a large portion of the land mass that they considered the Confederacy is gone. It's just inconsequential. It's backwatered. It doesn't matter what happens in the Trans-Mississippi. The war is happening out there. There's partisan raiding and murder, and there is active campaigning happening throughout 64. But it's almost inconsequential. Whatever's going to happen out there, they're fighting their own civil war. Anything east of the Mississippi River now is the war. And how is the war going to play out? And now you have this beacon of hope for the Confederacy that's lost. To counter that, what Vicksburg becomes for the Union also is backwater as far as the military is concerned. But this becomes really the beacon of hope for thousands of self-manumitted slaves, people that freed themselves from their plantations, and they came to Vicksburg because of the protection of the U.S. Army. But this was a place of opportunity for them. It was a place of mass education. It was a place of jobs, skill sets, learning. It was an opportunity to eventually utilize those inalienable rights that they should have always been guaranteed. And there's not many places in the Deep South that's happening, and we talk about Juneteenth becoming a national holiday because of Gordon Granger's order number 3 in Galveston, Texas, and that being the day that we're celebrating as the end of slavery in the war, right? In Vicksburg, it's July 4th. It's Independence Day. That is the day, and it's a day that white Southerners looked at as a day that they never wanted to talk about. And a perpetuated myth in Vicksburg is that they didn't celebrate the 4th of July until after the Second World War.
That's not true. About this. So what is the truth then? Like, did they not celebrate it at all? Like, is there anything to that?
There's evidence that they did some parades and things like that, especially around wars, the First World War and obviously after the Second World War. But it's a tale of different people. One, the Union Army celebrates the 4th of July during the war, right? So the fact that they didn't celebrate it there's people celebrating it during the war. Because one, they're commemorating the fall of Vicksburg, but they're also commemorating Independence Day. Then there's the racial dynamic. Who's celebrating it? Well, they'll tell you, we never celebrated it. Who? White Southerners certainly were not adamantly and openly going to commemorate the 4th of July in Vicksburg because of what it meant. Black Southerners, on the other hand, very much gathered in large groups to commemorate the fall of Vicksburg, and Independence Day is our nation's holiday. And they very much did that. However, as time went on, with first black codes and then Jim Crow and the subjugation of African Americans in the Deep South, you bet your bottom dollar that the white populace tried to subvert any effort to celebrate July 4th. So if they talk about not celebrating July 4th, there was a subversive effort to ensure that nobody was doing it because of the connotations behind July 4th, right? And but there's newspaper articles throughout the late 19th century, early 20th century of having some parades and things like that. But the African American community, 100%, were the ones that kept up that tradition until the soldiers came back from the Second World War, and a visit from future President Eisenhower. The former, obviously, Allied commander, visited Vicksburg, gave a speech which basically trumped up the spirit of America, right? Hey, yeah, the Civil War has been over. We all just came back and fought fascism and destroyed Nazis, and we're home. We survived, and it's time to celebrate America. And of course, the South had other issues that were compounded with the racial hierarchy that had to be destroyed with the Civil Rights Movement. But at least at that point of time, they acknowledged the 4th of July as our nation's holiday. And that perpetuated myth was over.
So is it a party down there now in 2020s? In July?
Right.
4th? Is it a town that goes off?
Like anywhere else, huge firework displays, people out and about. If you haven't been to Vicksburg, much like the French Quarter in New Orleans, there's no open container law from 1 point to 11 o'clock in the historic district. So people in the old days, and it's a great city, man. It's a great place. There's so much
great time. I had a great time there.
So much history here, and of course it transcends the Civil War. The Civil War just happens to be that people think about with Vicksburg, but it was a river city too, and it was cosmopolitan. It had a massively huge Jewish population, a huge German population, Irish, Creole, French, Spanish. I mean, an incredibly diverse place at the time period, just because the river made it that way. And it's one of the biggest reasons why, when the Civil War comes about, Warren County, Mississippi, and Vicksburg does not want to secede when Mississippi wants to go. Because if the state leaves, then they lose their economic viability on the river. And many of the people that lived in the city were Whig voters. Many of them were too, so they didn't want to go. So there's this story of Vicksburg. The people that are here is very dynamic, and it's a microcosm, really, of the war itself.
Awesome. I think that's a great note to sort of wind this down on, because it's a theme that we, I don't know if harp is the right word, Matt, but we definitely bring it up often enough that it maybe is harping. The issue of secession is not cut and dry across the Confederacy. It's not we're all in. I mean, we highlight it as often as we can that every state but South Carolina sends units to fight for the Union from like day one. And there are population centers all over the Deep South that for various reasons, and I'll speak very generally just to be safe, like don't want a part of this. Like I mentioned Hatteras earlier. Cape Hatteras secedes from the state of North Carolina pretty much instantaneously from South or North Carolina secession. They remain with the Union. Watertown, Virginia, a lot of Loudoun and Fauquier counties locally to us in Virginia. Very pro-union. I mean, Samuel Means's Loudoun Independent Rangers are a union-affiliated organization. Down here, I actually, before visiting Vicksburg, was aware that, Vicksburg was more interested in remaining in the Union because of those financial ties. Similar cause other way, Baltimore here in Maryland very much is pro-South because of its financial ties. So this conversation is very complex, and I think that's a good way to sort of to wind it down is like, Vicksburg is a lot of things. It is obviously for us, it's the big siege story, but it's so much more. And when you explore anything, there's more than just that surface story. And Vicksburg's got a pretty rich story underneath the siege in 1863. So I'd love to come back to Vicksburg. I'd love to make it down there. Come see you in person and have you take us around and show us some things. So we'll try to work that out in the next summer or so, or maybe even the winter.
There you go.
It's probably better to visit Vicksburg in the winter.
Right. Vicksburg in the winter is much better because it's a very, very cold 70 degrees down here.
Yeah. I'll take it. I do love the cold.
We're going to have to plan that to do that on our own time because I very soon at the end of this month we'll be leaving Vicksburg for Mill Springs Battlefield. That's my next duty station.
Hey, congratulations, mate. Good job.
Right. You had hinted that there was something in the works. I'm glad that you took the time to announce that here. Mill Springs, that's one of the newest units in the Park Service.
Correct. We'll have to do a Mill Springs episode.
Yes.
Yes, we will.
Well, my final parting thing for Vicksburg and its ties throughout the American Civil War is federal soldiers marching from the Battle of Port Gibson arrive at the doorstep of Elizabeth Meade Ingram, and as the Confederate soldiers had utilized her front yard as staging area for delaying action, and of course the Confederates couldn't hold back the onslaught that was the Confederate or the Union advance, and when the Union officers and enlisted men arrive at her gate and they start to come into her house, she pleads, "Don't you know my brother is a general in your army?" And her brother was none other than Major General George Gordon Meade. And so was living just north of Port Gibson, Mississippi, married to her husband, I believe, Alfred Ingram, and they owned a plantation just north of Port Gibson. And the reason why the federal soldiers didn't ransack or burn her home was because she came out and said, "Hey, my brother's an officer, a general in your army. You ever heard of him?"
Yeah. He beat the shit out of Robert E. Lee at the same time we did this number. So yeah, we've heard of him. Right. Snapping Turtle.
I was gonna say, at a particular time period, I'm pretty sure they're getting their butts kicked at Chancellorsville, but that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Details don't matter. We've heard of this guy. Because when we talk about Fredericksburg, I always bring up Meade's the guy. I mean, Meade breaks Jackson's lines. That's why I make fun of John Reynolds. So, man, you can hear all those stories in our Fredericksburg episodes, in the Gettysburg coverage. I do all those shell lobbings. Andrew, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about one of our favorite campaigns. I don't even want to say often overlooked. Always overlooked here in the East. I mean, we basically forget that you all even have a part of the war. Essentially, the war was fought in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. If you ask anybody out here, they are completely unaware of anything else. So thank you for coming on to our podcast to help us, do what we can here in the Eastern theater of the war, and talk about the war as a whole, not just 3 days in Pennsylvania in July, at least 40-something days in Mississippi and Louisiana. No, there's so much more. So, Andrew, thank you so much. And congratulations on your new gig at Mill Springs, and we will have you back. For our listeners out there, this has been a blitz of several days. Matt and I have never done anything like this before. The last summer when we did our very first blitz, it was like we'll put out an episode every 3 weeks. We have put out 3 episodes in like 5 days at this point. So thanks for hanging out with us. If you need a break, take a short one, please come back. But no, we definitely appreciate the fact that you've allowed us the opportunity to drop so much of this on you this summer. We love Gettysburg as much as we like to make fun of it. We love that story. We love Vicksburg, and it's been amazing to do all this. So, Scott Hartwig is out right now. Cody Aish is out right now. If you're listening today on July 4th, as this one comes out now, Andrew Miller's is out right now. There is more coming from Scott Hartwig. We have some stuff from the field. There's so much. I don't know how to describe it, Matt. At this point, if you're not ready, it's too late. You're done for. The History Things podcast is just loaded and ready to drop it. So there is places to follow us: social media, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You can keep up with all of this stuff, the From the Field stuff, the episode schedules. And as always, go to where you listen to the show: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, 5-star reviews, ratings. These things help the show a lot. You guys have been delivering in the clutch. Thank you so much for lifting the show up. And thanks for hanging out with us for this blitz. So I'm going to get out of here because honestly, if you knew what happened behind the scenes today, Matt and I had we had our own mini blitz today. We've had at this point, what time is it now? It is 10:30 p.m. as we wind this recording down. Matt and I have been on the clock for almost 12 hours.
Yep.
Like we've been doing the podcast almost 12 straight hours at this point. So Andrew, thank you. Thank you so much. For our guest today, Andrew Miller. For my co-host with the most, Maddie B, I am your co-host, Pat McGuire, saying thanks so much for listening to the History Things podcast. We will catch you later.
Have a good night.
You've been listening to the History Things podcast. Follow the guys on Facebook and Instagram at the History Things podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.